Chapter Roman 41 The Young Master. 2 days after, a young man drove a light wagon up through the avenue of china trees and, throwing the reins hastily on the horse's neck, sprang out and inquired for the owner of the place. It was George Shelby, and to show how he came to be there, we must go back in our story. The letter of Miss Ophelia to Mrs. Shelby had, by some unfortunate accident, been detained for a month or two at some remote post office before it reached its destination, and, of course, before it was received. Tom was already lost to view among the distant swamps of the Red River. Mrs. Shelby read the intelligence with the deepest concern, but any immediate action upon it was an impossibility. She was then in attendance on the sick bed of her husband, who lay delirious in the crisis of a fever. Master George Shelby, who, in the interval, had changed from a boy to a tall young man, was her constant and faithful assistant, and her only reliance in superintending his father's affairs. Miss Ophelia had taken the precaution to send them the name of the lawyer who did business for the St. Clairs, and the most that, in the emergency, could be done was to address a letter of inquiry to him. The sudden death of Mr. Shelby, a few days after, brought, of course, an absorbing pressure of other interests for a season. Mr. Shelby showed his confidence in his wife's ability by appointing her sole executrix upon his estates, and thus immediately a large and complicated amount of business was brought upon her hands. Mrs. Shelby, with characteristic energy, applied herself to the work of straightening the entangled web of affairs, and she and George were for some time occupied with collecting and examining accounts, selling property, and settling debts. For Mrs. Shelby was determined that everything should be brought into tangible and recognizable shape, let the consequences to her prove what they may. In the meantime, they received a letter from the lawyer to whom Miss Ophelia had referred them, saying that he knew nothing of the matter, that the man was sold at a public auction, and that, beyond receiving the money, he knew nothing of the affair. Neither George nor Mrs. Shelby could be easy at this result, and accordingly, some 6 months after, the latter, having business for his mother down the river, resolved to visit New Orleans in person and push his inquiries in hopes of discovering Tom's whereabouts and restoring him. After some months of unsuccessful search, by the merest accident, George fell in with a man in New Orleans who happened to be possessed of the desired information, and with his money in his pocket, our hero took steamboat for Red River, resolving to find out and repurchase his old friend. He was soon introduced into the house, where he found Legree in the sitting room. Legree received the stranger with a kind of surly hospitality. "I understand," said the young man, "that you bought, in New Orleans, a boy named Tom. He used to be on my father's place, and I came to see if I couldn't buy him back." Legree's brow grew dark, and he broke out passionately, "Yes, I did buy such a fellow, and a h.l. of a bargain I had of it, too. The most rebellious, saucy, impudent dog set up my niggers to run away, got off 2 gals worth 800 or 1,000 apiece. He owned to that, and when I bid him tell me where they was, he up and said he knew, but he wouldn't tell, and stood to it, though I gave him the cussedest flogging I ever gave nigger yet. I believe he's trying to die, but I don't know as he'll make it out." "Where is he?" said George impetuously. "Let me see him." The cheeks of the young man were crimson, and his eyes flashed fire, but he prudently said nothing as yet. "He's in debt our shed," said a little fellow who stood holding George's horse. Legree kicked the boy and swore at him, but George, without saying another word, turned and strode to the spot. Tom had been lying 2 days since the fatal night, not suffering, for every nerve of suffering was blunted and destroyed. He lay, for the most part, in a quiet stupor, for the laws of a powerful and well-knit frame would not at once release the imprisoned spirit. By stealth, there had been there in the darkness of the night, poor desolated creatures who stole from their scanty hours' rest, that they may repay to him some of those ministrations of love in which he had always been so abundant. Truly, those poor disciples had little to give, only the cup of cold water, but it was given with full hearts. Tears had fallen on that honest, insensible face, tears of late repentance in the poor, ignorant heathen, whom his dying love and patience had awakened to repentance, and bitter prayers breathed over him to a late found Saviour, of whom they scarce knew more than the name, but whom the yearning, ignorant heart of man never implores in vain. Cassie, who had glided out of her place of concealment, and, by overhearing, learned the sacrifice that had been made for her, and Emmeline had been there the night before, defying the danger of detection, and moved by the last few words which the affectionate soul had yet strength to breathe. The long winter of despair, the ice of years, had given way, and the dark, despairing woman had wept and prayed. When George entered the shed, he felt his head giddy and his heart sick. "Is it possible? Is it possible?" said he, kneeling down by him. "Uncle Tom, my poor, poor old friend." Something in the voice penetrated to the ear of the dying. He moved his head gently, smiled, and said, "Jesus can make a dying bed feel soft as down pillows are." Tears, which did honor to his manly heart, fell from the young man's eyes as he bent over his poor friend. "Oh, dear Uncle Tom, do wake, do speak once more. Look up, here's Masser George, your own little Masser George. Don't you know me?" "Masser George," said Tom, opening his eyes and speaking in a feeble voice. "Masser George." He looked bewildered. Slowly the idea seemed to fill his soul, and the vacant eye became fixed and brightened, the whole face lighted up, the hard hands clasped, and tears ran down the cheeks. "Bless the Lord. It's all I wanted. They haven't forgot me. It warms my soul. It does my heart good. Now I shall die content. Bless the Lord, on my soul. You shan't die. You mustn't die, nor think of it. I've come to buy you and take you home," said George, with impetuous vehemence. "Oh, Masser George, ye are too late. The Lord's bought me, and is going to take me home, and I long to go. Heaven is better than Kintuck. Oh, don't die. It'll kill me. It'll break my heart to think what you've suffered, and lying in this old shed here. Poor, poor fellow." "Don't call me poor fellow," said Tom, solemnly. "I have been poor fellow, but that's all past and gone now. I'm right in the door, going into glory. Oh, Masser George, heaven has come! Exclamation! I've got the victory. The Lord Jesus has given it to me. Glory be to his name." George was awestruck at the force, the vehemence, the power with which these broken sentences were uttered. He sat gazing in silence. Tom grasped his hand and continued, "Ye mustn't, now, tell Chloe, poor soul, how ye found me. 'T would be so dreadful to her. Only tell her ye found me going into glory, and that I couldn't stay for no one. And tell her the Lord stood by me everywhere and allays, and made everything light and easy. And oh, the poor chillun and the baby, my old heart's been most broke for 'em. Time and again, tell 'em all to follow me, follow me. Give my love to Masser and dear good missus and everybody in the place. Ye don't know, 'pears like I loves 'em all. I loves every creature everywhere. It's nothing but love. Oh, Masser George, what a thing 't is to be a Christian." At this moment, Legree sauntered up to the door of the shed, looked in, with a dogged air of affected carelessness, and turned away. "The old Satan," said George, in his indignation. "It's a comfort to think the devil will pay him for this, some of these days." "Oh, don't. Oh, ye mustn't," said Tom, grasping his hand. "He's a poor misable critter. It's awful to think on 't. Oh, if he only could repent, the Lord would forgive him now. But I'm feared he never will." "I hope he won't," said George. "I never want to see him in heaven." "Hush, Masser George, it worries me. Don't feel so. He ain't done me no real harm, only opened the gate of the kingdom for me. That's all. At this moment, the sudden flush of strength, which the joy of meeting his young master had infused into the dying man, gave way. A sudden sinking fell upon him. He closed his eyes, and that mysterious and sublime change passed over his face that told the approach of other worlds. He began to draw his breath with long, deep inspirations, and his broad chest rose and fell heavily. The expression of his face was that of a conqueror. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? He said, in a voice that contended with mortal weakness, and with a smile he fell asleep. George sat fixed with solemn awe. It seemed to him that the place was holy, and as he closed the lifeless eyes and rose up from the dead, only one thought possessed him, that expressed by his simple old friend, what a thing it is to be a Christian. He turned. Legree was standing sullenly behind him. Something in that dying scene had checked the natural fierceness of youthful passion. The presence of the man was simply loathsome to George, and he felt only an impulse to get away from him, with as few words as possible. Fixing his keen dark eyes on Legree, he simply said, pointing to the dead, "You have got all you ever can of him. What shall I pay you for the body? I will take it away and bury it decently." "I don't sell dead niggers," said Legree, doggedly. "You are welcome to bury him where and when you like." "Boys," said George, in an authoritative tone, to 2 or 3 negroes who were looking at the body, "help me lift him up and carry him to my wagon, and get me a spade." One of them ran for a spade. The other 2 assisted George to carry the body to the wagon. George neither spoke to nor looked at Legree, who did not countermand his orders, but stood whistling with an air of forced unconcern. He sulkily followed them to where the wagon stood at the door. George spread his cloak in the wagon, and had the body carefully disposed of in it, moving the seat so as to give it room. Then he turned, fixed his eyes on Legree, and said, with forced composure, "I have not, as yet, said to you what I think of this most atrocious affair. This is not the time and place. But, sir, this innocent blood shall have justice. I will proclaim this murder. I will go to the very first magistrate and expose you." "Do," said Legree, snapping his fingers scornfully. "I'd like to see you doing it. Where you going to get witnesses? How you going to prove it? Come, now." George saw at once the force of this defiance. There was not a white person on the place, and in all Southern courts, the testimony of colored blood is nothing. He felt, at that moment, as if he could have rent the heavens with his heart's indignant cry for justice, but in vain. "After all, what a fuss for a dead nigger," said Legree. The word was as a spark to a powder magazine. Prudence was never a cardinal virtue of the Kentucky boy. George turned and, with one indignant blow, knocked Legree flat upon his face, and as he stood over him, blazing with wrath and defiance, he would have formed no bad personification of his great namesake triumphing over the dragon. Some men, however, are decidedly bettered by being knocked down. If a man lays them fairly flat in the dust, they seem immediately to conceive a respect for him, and Legree was one of the sort. As he rose, therefore, and brushed the dust from his clothes, he eyed the slowly retreating wagon with some evident consideration, nor did he open his mouth till it was out of sight. Beyond the boundaries of the plantation, George had noticed a dry, sandy knoll shaded by a few trees. There they made the grave. "Shall we take off the cloak, masser?" said the negroes when the grave was ready. "No, no, bury it with him. It's all I can give you now, poor Tom, and you shall have it." They laid him in, and the men shoveled away silently. They banked it up and laid green turf over it. "You may go, boys," said George, slipping a quarter into the hand of each. They lingered about, however. "If young masser would please buy us," said one. "We'd serve him so faithful," said the other. "Hard times here, masser," said the first. "Do, masser, buy us, please." I can't," said George, with difficulty motioning them off. "It's impossible." The poor fellows looked dejected and walked off in silence. "Witness, eternal God," said George, kneeling on the grave of his poor friend. "Oh, witness, that, from this hour, I will do what one man can to drive out this curse of slavery from my land. There is no monument to mark the last resting place of our friend. He needs none. His Lord knows where he lies and will raise him up, immortal, to appear with him when he shall appear in his glory. Pity him not. Such a life and death is not for pity. Not in the riches of omnipotence is the chief glory of God, but in self-denying, suffering, love. And blessed are the men whom he calls to fellowship with him, bearing their cross after him with patience. Chapter Roman 42. An authentic ghost story. For some remarkable reason, ghostly legends were uncommonly rife about this time among the servants on Legree's place. It was whisperingly asserted that footsteps, in the dead of night, had been heard descending the garret stairs and patrolling the house. In vain the doors of the upper entry had been locked. The ghost either carried a duplicate key in its pocket, or availed itself of a ghost's immemorial privilege of coming through the keyhole, and promenaded as before, with a freedom that was alarming. Authorities were somewhat divided as to the outward form of the spirit, owing to a custom quite prevalent among Negroes, and, for aught we know, among whites, too, of invariably shutting the eyes and covering up heads under blankets, petticoats, or whatever else may come in use for a shelter on these occasions. Of course, as everybody knows, when the bodily eyes are thus out of the lists, the spiritual eyes are uncommonly vivacious and perspicuous, and therefore there were abundance of full-length portraits of the ghost, abundantly sworn and testified to, which, as if often the case with portraits, agreed with each other in no particular, except the common family peculiarity of the ghost tribe, the wearing of a white sheet. The poor souls were not versed in ancient history, and did not know that Shakespeare had authenticated this costume by telling how the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the streets of Rome. Asterisk Hamlet, Act I, Scene 1, lines 115-116, and therefore they're all hitting upon this as a striking fact in pneumatology, which we recommend to the attention of spiritual media generally. Be it as it may, we have private reasons for knowing that a tall figure in a white sheet did walk at the most approved ghostly hours around the Legree premises, pass out the doors, glide about the house, disappear at intervals, and reappearing, pass up the silent stairway into that fatal garret, and that, in the morning, the entry doors were all found shut and locked as firm as ever. Legree could not help overhearing this whispering, and it was all the more exciting to him from the pains that were taken to conceal it from him. He drank more brandy than usual, held up his head briskly, and swore louder than ever in the daytime. But he had bad dreams, and the visions of his head on his bed were anything but agreeable. The night after Tom's body had been carried away, he rode to the next town for a carouse, and had a high one, got home late and tired, locked his door, took out the key, and went to bed. After all, let a man take what pains he may to hush it down. A human soul is an awful ghostly, unquiet possession for a bad man to have. Who knows the metes and bounds of it? Who knows all its awful, perhapses, those shudderings and tremblings, which it can no more live down than it can outlive its own eternity? What a fool is he who locks his door to keep out spirits, who has in his own bosom a spirit he dares not meet alone, whose voice, smothered far down and piled over with mountains of earthliness, is yet like the forewarning trumpet of doom. But Legree locked his door, and set a chair against it. He set a night lamp at the head of his bed and put his pistols there. He examined the catches and fastenings of the windows and then swore he didn't care for the devil and all his angels and went to sleep. Well, he slept, for he was tired, slept soundly. But, finally, there came over his sleep a shadow, a horror, an apprehension of something dreadful hanging over him. It was his mother's shroud, he thought, but Cassie had it, holding it up and showing it to him. He heard a confused noise of screams and groanings, and with it all he knew he was asleep, and he struggled to wake himself. He was half awake. He was sure something was coming into his room. He knew the door was opening, but he could not stir hand or foot. At last he turned with a start. The door was open, and he saw a hand putting out his light. It was a cloudy, misty moonlight, and there he saw it, something white, gliding in. He heard the still rustle of its ghostly garments. It stood still by his bed. A cold hand touched his. A voice said 3 times, in a low, fearful whisper, "Come, come, come." And while he lay, sweating with terror, he knew not when or how, the thing was gone. He sprang out of bed and pulled at the door. It was shut and locked, and the man fell down in a swoon. After this, Legree became a harder drinker than ever before. He no longer drank cautiously, prudently, but imprudently and recklessly. There were reports around the country, soon after, that he was sick and dying. Excess had brought on that frightful disease that seems to throw the lurid shadows of a coming retribution back into the present life. None could bear the horrors of that sick room, when he raved and screamed and spoke of sights which almost stopped the blood of those who heard him, and at his dying bed stood a stern, white, inexorable figure, saying, "Come, come, come." By a singular coincidence, on the very night that this vision appeared to Legree, the house door was found open in the morning, and some of the Negroes had seen 2 white figures gliding down the avenue towards the high road. It was near sunrise when Cassie and Emmeline paused for a moment in a little knot of trees near the town. Cassie was dressed after the manner of the Creole Spanish ladies, wholly in black, a small black bonnet on her head, covered by a veil thick with embroidery, concealed her face. It had been agreed that, in their escape, she was to personate the character of a Creole lady, and Emmeline that of her servant. Brought up from early life in connection with the highest society, the language, movements, and air of Cassie were all in agreement with this idea, and she had still enough remaining with her of a once splendid wardrobe and sets of jewels to enable her to personate the thing to advantage. She stopped in the outskirts of the town, where she had noticed trunks for sale and purchased a handsome one. This she requested the man to send along with her, and accordingly, thus escorted by a boy wheeling her trunk, and Emmeline behind her, carrying her carpet bag and sundry bundles, she made her appearance at the small tavern like a lady of consideration. The first person that struck her after her arrival was George Shelby, who was staying there, awaiting the next boat. Cassie had remarked the young man from her loophole in the garret, and seen him bear away the body of Tom, and observed with secret exultation his rencontre with Legree. Subsequently she had gathered from the conversations she had overheard among the Negroes as she glided about in her ghostly disguise after nightfall, who he was, and in what relation he stood to Tom. She, therefore, felt an immediate accession of confidence when she found that he was, like herself, awaiting the next boat. Cassie's air and manner, address, and evident command of money prevented any rising disposition to suspicion in the hotel. People never inquire too closely into those who are fair on the main point of paying, well, a thing which Cassie had foreseen when she provided herself with money. In the edge of the evening, a boat was heard coming along, and George Shelby handed Cassie aboard with the politeness which comes naturally to every Kentuckian, and exerted himself to provide her with a good stateroom. Cassie kept her room and bed on pretext of illness during the whole time they were on Red River, and was waited on with obsequious devotion by her attendant. When they arrived at the Mississippi River, George, having learned that the course of the strange lady was upward like his own, proposed to take a stateroom for her on the same boat with himself, good-naturedly compassionating her feeble health, and desirous to do what he could to assist her. Behold, therefore, the whole party safely transferred to the good steamer Cincinnati, and sweeping up the river under a powerful head of steam. Cassie's health was much better. She sat upon the guards, came to the table, and was remarked upon in the boat as a lady that must have been very handsome. From the moment that George got the first glimpse of her face, he was troubled with one of those fleeting and indefinite likenesses, which almost everybody can remember and has been, at times, perplexed with. He could not keep himself from looking at her, and watching her perpetually, at table, or sitting at her stateroom door. Still, she would encounter the young man's eyes fixed on her, and politely withdrawn, when she showed by her countenance that she was sensible to the observation. Cassie became uneasy. She began to think that he suspected something, and finally resolved to throw herself entirely on his generosity, and entrusted him with her whole history. George was heartily disposed to sympathize with any one who had escaped from Legree's plantation, a place that he could not remember or speak of with patience and with the courageous disregard of consequences which is characteristic of his age and state. He assured her that he would do all in his power to protect and bring them through. The next stateroom to Cassie's was occupied by a French lady named de Thou, who was accompanied by a fine little daughter, a child of some 12 summers. This lady, having gathered from George's conversation that he was from Kentucky, seemed evidently disposed to cultivate his acquaintance, in which design she was seconded by the graces of her little girl, who was about as pretty a plaything as ever diverted the weariness of a fortnight's trip on a steamboat. George's chair was often placed at her stateroom door, and Cassie, as she sat upon the guards, could hear their conversation. Madame de Thou was very minute in her inquiries as to Kentucky, where she said she had resided in a former period of her life. George discovered, to his surprise, that her former residence must have been in his own vicinity, and her inquiries showed a knowledge of people and things in his vicinity that was perfectly surprising to him. Do you know, said Madame de Thou to him one day, of any man in your neighborhood of the name of Harris? There is an old fellow of that name lives not far from my father's place, said George. We never have had much intercourse with him, though. He is a large slave owner, I believe, said Madame de Thou, with a manner which seemed to betray more interest than she was exactly willing to show. He is, said George, looking rather surprised at her manner. Did you ever know of his having, perhaps you may have heard of his having a mulatto boy named George? Oh, certainly, George Harris. I know him well. He married a servant of my mother's, but has escaped now to Canada. He has, said Madame de Thou, quickly. Thank God. George looked a surprised inquiry, but said nothing. Madame de Thou leaned her head on her hand and burst into tears. He is my brother, she said. Madame, said George, with a strong accent of surprise. Yes, said Madame de Thou, lifting her head proudly and wiping her tears. Mr. Shelby, George Harris is my brother. I am perfectly astonished, said George, pushing back his chair a pace or two and looking at Madame de Thou. I was sold to the South when he was a boy, said she. I was bought by a good and generous man. He took me with him to the West Indies, set me free, and married me. It is but lately that he died, and I was going up to Kentucky to see if I could find and redeem my brother. I heard him speak of a sister Emily that was sold south, said George. Yes, truly, I'm the one, said Madame de Thou. Tell me what sort of a "A very fine young man," said George, notwithstanding the curse of slavery that lay on him. He sustained a first-rate character, both for intelligence and principle. "I know, you see," he said, "because he married in our family." "What sort of a girl?" said Madame de Thou, eagerly. "A treasure," said George, "a beautiful, intelligent, amiable girl, very pious. My mother had brought her up and trained her as carefully, almost, as a daughter. She could read and write, embroider and sew beautifully, and was a beautiful singer." "Was she born in your house?" said Madame de Thou. "No. Father bought her once, in one of his trips to New Orleans, and brought her up as a present to mother. She was about 8 or 9 years old then. Father would never tell mother what he gave for her, but the other day, in looking over his old papers, we came across the bill of sale. He paid an extravagant sum for her, to be sure. I suppose, on account of her extraordinary beauty." George sat with his back to Cassie and did not see the absorbed expression of her countenance as he was giving these details. At this point in the story, she touched his arm, and, with a face perfectly white with interest, said, "Do you know the names of the people he bought her of?" "A man of the name of Simmons, I think, was the principal in the transaction. At least, I think that was the name on the bill of sale." "Oh, my God!" said Cassie, and fell insensible on the floor of the cabin. George was wide awake now, and so was Madame de Thou. Though neither of them could conjecture what was the cause of Cassie's fainting, still they made all the tumult which is proper in such cases. George upsetting a wash pitcher and breaking 2 tumblers in the warmth of his humanity, and various ladies in the cabin, hearing that somebody had fainted, crowded the stateroom door, and kept out all the air they possibly could, so that, on the whole, everything was done that could be expected. Poor Cassie, when she recovered, turned her face to the wall and wept, and sobbed like a child. Perhaps, mother, you can tell what she was thinking of. Chapter Roman 43 Results. The rest of our story is soon told. George shall be interested as any other young man may be by the romance of the incident, no less than by feelings of humanity, was at the pains to send to Cassie the bill of sale of Eliza, whose date and name all corresponded with her own knowledge of facts, and felt no doubt upon her mind as to the identity of her child. It remained now only for her to trace out the path of the fugitives. Madame de Thou and she, thus drawn together by the singular coincidence of their fortunes, proceeded immediately to Canada and began a tour of inquiry among the stations where the numerous fugitives from slavery are located. At Amherstburg they found the missionary with whom George and Eliza had taken shelter on their first arrival in Canada, and through him were enabled to trace the family to Montreal. George and Eliza had now been 5 years free. George had found constant occupation in the shop of a worthy machinist, where he had been earning a competent support for his family, which, in the meantime, had been increased by the addition of another daughter. Little Harry, a fine bright boy, had been put to a good school, and was making rapid proficiency in knowledge. The worthy pastor of the station in Amherstburg, where George had first landed, was so much interested in the statements of Madame de Thou and Cassie that he yielded to the solicitations of the former to accompany them to Montreal in their search, she bearing all the expense of the expedition. The scene now changes to a small, neat tenement in the outskirts of Montreal. The time, evening. A cheerful fire blazes on the hearth. A tea table, covered with a snowy cloth, stands prepared for the evening meal. In one corner of the room was a table covered with a green cloth, where was an open writing desk, pens, paper, and over it a shelf of well-selected books. This was George's study, the same zeal for self-improvement which led him to steal the much-coveted arts of reading and writing amid all the toil and discouragements of his early life, still led him to devote all his leisure time to self-cultivation. At this present time, he is seated at the table making notes from a volume of the family library he has been reading. "Come, George," says Eliza, "you've been gone all day. Do put down that book and let's talk while I'm getting tea, do." And little Eliza seconds the effort by toddling up to her father and trying to pull the book out of his hand and install herself on his knee as a substitute. "Oh, you little witch," says George, yielding as in such circumstances man always must. "That's right," says Eliza as she begins to cut a loaf of bread. Little older she looks, her form a little fuller, her air more matronly than of yore, but evidently contented and happy as woman need be. "Harry, my boy, how did you come on in that sum today?" says George as he laid his hand on his son's head. Harry has lost his long curls, but he can never lose those eyes and eyelashes and that fine, bold brow that flushes with triumph as he answers, "I did it, every bit of it, myself, father, and nobody helped me." "That's right," says his father, "depend on yourself, my son. You have a better chance than ever your poor father had." At this moment, there is a rap at the door, and Eliza goes and opens it. The delighted, "Why, this you?" calls up her husband, and the good pastor of Amherstburg is welcomed. There are two more women with him, and Eliza asks them to sit down. Now, if the truth must be told, the honest pastor had arranged a little program according to which this affair was to develop itself, and on the way up, all had very cautiously and prudently exhorted each other not to let things out except according to previous arrangement. What was the good man's consternation, therefore, just as he had motioned to the ladies to be seated and was taking out his pocket handkerchief to wipe his mouth, so as to proceed to his introductory speech in good order, when Madame de Thou upset the whole plan by throwing her arms around George's neck and laying all out at once by saying, "Oh, George, don't you know me? I'm your sister Emily." Cassie had seated herself more composedly and would have carried on her part very well had not little Eliza suddenly appeared before her in exact shape and form, every outline and curl, just as her daughter was when she saw her last. The little thing peered up in her face, and Cassie caught her up in her arms, pressed her to her bosom, saying, what at the moment she really believed, "Darling, I'm your mother." In fact, it was a troublesome matter to do up exactly in proper order, but the good pastor, at last, succeeded in getting everybody quiet, and delivering the speech with which he had intended to open the exercises, and in which, at last, he succeeded so well that his whole audience were sobbing about him in a manner that ought to satisfy any orator, ancient or modern. They knelt together, and the good man prayed, for there are some feelings so agitated and tumultuous that they can find rest only by being poured into the bosom of Almighty love, and then, rising up, the new-found family embraced each other with a holy trust in Him, who, from such peril and dangers and by such unknown ways, had brought them together. The notebook of a missionary among the Canadian fugitives contains truth stranger than fiction. How can it be otherwise when a system prevails which whirls families and scatters their members as the wind whirls and scatters the leaves of autumn? These shores of refuge, like the eternal shore, often unite again in glad communion hearts that for long years have mourned each other as lost. And affecting beyond expression is the earnestness with which every new arrival among them is met, if perhaps it may bring tidings of mother, sister, child, or wife still lost to view in the shadows of slavery. Deeds of heroism are wrought here more than those of romance, when, defying torture and braving death itself, the fugitive voluntarily threads his way back to the terrors and perils of that dark land, that he may bring out his sister, or mother, or wife. One young man, of whom a missionary has told us, twice recaptured, and suffering shameful stripes for his heroism, had escaped again, and in a letter which we heard read, tells his friends that he is going back a third time. that he may, at last, bring away his sister. My good sir, is this man a hero or a criminal? Would not you do as much for your sister? And can you blame him? But, to return to our friends, whom we left wiping their eyes and recovering themselves from too great and sudden a joy. They are now seated around the social board and are getting decidedly companionable, only that Cassie, who keeps little Eliza on her lap occasionally, squeezes the little thing in a manner that rather astonishes her, and obstinately refuses to have her mouth stuffed with cake to the extent the little one desires, alleging, what the child rather wonders at, that she has got something better than cake and doesn't want it. And, truly, in 2 or 3 days such a change has passed over Cassie that our readers would scarcely know her. The despairing, haggard expression of her face had given way to one of gentle trust. She seemed to sink at once into the bosom of the family and take the little ones into her heart as something for which it long had waited. Truly, her love seemed to flow more naturally to the little Eliza than to her own daughter, for she was the exact image and body of the child whom she had lost. The little one was a flowery bond between mother and daughter, through whom grew up acquaintanceship and affection. Eliza's steady, consistent piety, regulated by the constant reading of the sacred word, made her a proper guide for the shattered and wearied mind of her mother. Cassie yielded at once and with her whole soul to every good influence and became a devout and tender Christian. After a day or two, Madame de Thou told her brother more particularly of her affairs. The death of her husband had left her an ample fortune, which she generously offered to share with the family. When she asked George what way she could best apply it for him, he answered, "Give me an education, Emily. That has always been my heart's desire. Then I can do all the rest." On mature deliberation, it was decided that the whole family should go for some years to France, where they sailed, carrying Emmeline with them. The good looks of the latter won the affection of the first mate of the vessel, and shortly after entering the port, she became his wife. George remained 4 years at a French university, and, applying himself with an unintermitted zeal, obtained a very thorough education. Political troubles in France, at last, led the family again to seek an asylum in this country. George's feelings and views as an educated man may be best expressed in a letter to one of his friends. "I feel somewhat at a loss as to my future course. True, as you have said to me, I may mingle in the circles of the whites. In this country, my shade of color is so slight, and that of my wife and family scarce perceptible. Well, perhaps, on sufferance, I may. But, to tell you the truth, I have no wish to. My sympathies are not for my father's race, but for my mother's. To him, I was no more than a fine dog or horse. To my poor heart-broken mother, I was a child, and though I never saw her after the cruel sail that separated us till she died, yet I know she always loved me dearly. I know it by my own heart. When I think of all she suffered, of my own early sufferings, of the distresses and struggles of my heroic wife, of my sister, sold in the New Orleans slave market, though I hope to have no unchristian sentiments, yet I may be excused for saying I have no wish to pass for an American or to identify myself with them. It is with the oppressed, enslaved African race that I cast in my lot. And if I wished anything, I would wish myself 2 shades darker rather than one lighter. The desire and yearning of my soul is for an African nationality. I want a people that shall have a tangible, separate existence of its own. And where am I to look for it? Not in Haiti, for in Haiti they had nothing to start with. A stream cannot rise above its fountain. The race that formed the character of the Haitians was a worn-out, effeminate one, and, of course, the subject race will be centuries in rising to anything. Where, then, shall I look? On the shores of Africa I see a republic, a republic formed of picked men who, by energy and self-educating force, have, in many cases, individually raised themselves above a condition of slavery. Having gone through a preparatory stage of feebleness, this republic has, at last, become an acknowledged nation on the face of the earth, acknowledged by both France and England. There it is my wish to go and find myself a people. I am aware now that I shall have you all against me, but before you strike, hear me. During my stay in France, I have followed up with intense interest the history of my people in America. I have noted the struggle between abolitionist and colonizationist and have received some impressions as a distant spectator, which could never have occurred to me as a participator. I grant that this Liberia may have subserved all sorts of purposes by being played off in the hands of our oppressors against us. Doubtless, the scheme may have been used in unjustifiable ways as a means of retarding our emancipation, but the question to me is there not a God above all man's schemes? May he not have overruled their designs and founded for us a nation by them? In these days, a nation is born in a day. A nation starts now with all the great problems of republican life and civilization wrought out to its hand. It has not to discover, but only to apply. Let us, then, all take hold together with all our may and see what we can do with this new enterprise, and the whole splendid continent of Africa opens before us and our children. Our nation shall roll the tide of civilization and Christianity along its shores and plant their mighty republics that, growing with the rapidity of tropical vegetation, shall be for all coming ages. Do you say that I am deserting my enslaved brethren? I think not. If I forget them 1 hour, 1 moment of my life, so may God forget me. But what can I do for them here? Can I break their chains? No, not as an individual, but let me go and form part of a nation which shall have a voice in the councils of nations, and then we can speak. A nation has a right to argue, remonstrate, implore, and present the cause of its race, which an individual has not. If Europe ever becomes a grand council of free nations, as I trust in God it will, if their serfdom and all unjust and oppressive social inequalities are done away, and if they, as France and England have done, acknowledge our position, then, in the great Congress of Nations, we will make our appeal and present the cause of our enslaved and suffering race, and it cannot be that free, enlightened America will not then desire to wipe from her escutcheon that bar sinister which disgraces her among nations, and is as truly a curse to her as to the enslaved. But, you will tell me, our race have equal rights to mingle in the American Republic as the Irishman, the German, the Swede. Granted, they have. We ought to be free to meet and mingle, to rise by our individual worth, without any consideration of caste or color, and they who deny us this right are false to their own professed principles of human equality. We ought, in particular, to be allowed here. We have, more than the rights of common men, we have the claim of an injured race for reparation. But, then, I do not want it. I want a country, a nation of my own. I think that the African race has peculiarities, yet to be unfolded in the light of civilization and Christianity, which, if not the same with those of the Anglo-Saxon, may prove to be, morally, of evening a higher type. To the Anglo-Saxon race has been entrusted the destinies of the world during its pioneer period of struggle and conflict. To that mission, its stern, inflexible, energetic elements were well adapted, but as a Christian, I look for another era to arise. On its borders I trust we stand, and the throes that now convulse the nations are, to my hope, but the birth-pangs of an hour of universal peace and brotherhood. I trust that the development of Africa is to be essentially a Christian one. If not a dominant and commanding race, they are, at least, an affectionate, magnanimous, and forgiving one. Having been called in the furnace of injustice and oppression, they have need to bind closer to their hearts that sublime doctrine of love and forgiveness, through which alone they are to conquer, which it is to be their mission to spread over the continent of Africa. In myself, I confess, I am feeble for this, full half the blood in my veins is the hot and hasty Saxon, but I have an eloquent preacher of the gospel ever by my side, in the person of my beautiful wife. When I wander, her gentler spirit ever restores me, and keeps before my eyes the Christian calling and mission of our race. As a Christian patriot, as a teacher of Christianity, I go to my country, my chosen, my glorious Africa, and to her, in my heart, I sometimes apply those splendid words of prophecy. While you have been forsaken and hated, so that no man went through you, I will make you an eternal excellence, a joy of many generations. You will call me an enthusiast. You will tell me that I have not well considered what I am undertaking, but I have considered and counted the cost. I go to Liberia not as an Elysium of romance, but as to a field of work. I expect to work with both hands, to work hard, to work against all sorts of difficulties and discouragements, and to work till I die. This is what I go for, and in this I am quite sure I shall not be disappointed. Whatever you may think of my determination, do not divorce me from your confidence, and think that, in whatever I do, I act with a heart wholly given to my people. George Harris. George, with his wife, children, sister, and mother, embarked for Africa some few weeks after. If we are not mistaken, the world will yet hear from him there. Of our other characters, we have nothing very particular to write, except a word relating to Miss Ophelia and Topsy, and a farewell chapter, which we shall dedicate to George Shelby. Miss Ophelia took Topsy home to Vermont with her, much to the surprise of the grave, deliberative body whom a New Englander recognizes under the term our folks. Our folks, at first, thought it an odd and unnecessary addition to their well-trained domestic establishment, but so thoroughly efficient was Miss Ophelia in her conscientious endeavor to do her duty by her Eleve, that the child rapidly grew in grace and in favor with the family and neighborhood. At the age of womanhood, she was, by her own request, baptized and became a member of the Christian church in the place, and showed so much intelligence, activity, and zeal, and desire to do good in the world, that she was at last recommended and approved as a missionary to one of the stations in Africa, and we have heard that the same activity and ingenuity which, when a child, made her so multiform and restless in her developments, is now employed, in a safer and wholesomer manner, in teaching the children of her own country. P.S. It will be a satisfaction to some mother, also, to state that some inquiries, which were set on foot by Madame de Thou, have resulted recently in the discovery of Cassie's son. Being a young man of energy, he had escaped some years before his mother, and been received and educated by friends of the oppressed in the North. Chapter Roman 44. The Liberator. George Shelby had written to his mother merely a line, stating the day that she may expect him home. Of the death scene of his old friend, he had not the heart to write. He had tried several times, and only succeeded in half choking himself, and invariably finished by tearing up the paper, wiping his eyes, and rushing somewhere to get quiet. There was a pleased bustle although the Shelby mansion that day, in expectation of the arrival of young Masser George. Mrs. Shelby was seated in her comfortable parlor, where a cheerful hickory fire was dispelling the chill of the late autumn evening. A supper table, glittering with plate and cut glass, was set out, on whose arrangements our former friend, old Chloe, was presiding. Arrayed in a new calico dress, with clean, white apron, and high, well-starched turban, her black polished face glowing with satisfaction, she lingered with needless punctiliousness around the arrangements of the table merely as an excuse for talking a little to her mistress. Laws, now, won't it look natural to him? She said. Thar, I set his plate just where he likes it round by the fire. Masser George allers wants de warm seat. Oh, go way. Why didn't Sally get out de best teapot, de little new one Masser George got for Mrs. Christmas? I'll have it out. And Mrs. has heard from Masser George? She said inquiringly. Yes, Chloe, but only a line, just to say he would be home tonight if he could, that's all. Didn't say nothin' 'bout my old man, I s'pose, said Chloe, still fidgeting with the teacups. No, he didn't. He did not speak of anything, Chloe. He said he would tell all when he got home. Just like Masser George, he's allers so first for tellin' everything hisself. I allers minded dat are in Masser George. Don't see, for my part, how white people generally can bar to have to write things much as they do, written as such slow, wanna-see kind o' work. Mrs. Shelby smiled. I'm a thinkin' my old man won't know de boys and de baby. Lor, she's de biggest gal, now. Good she is, too, and peart, Polly is. She's out to the house, now, watchin' de hoe cake. I got just de very pattern my old man liked so much a backin, just sich as I gin him the mornin' he was took off. Lord bless us, how I felt dat our morning. Mrs. Shelby sighed and felt a heavy weight on her heart. At this allusion, she had felt uneasy ever since she received her son's letter, lest something should prove to be hidden behind the veil of silence, which he had drawn. Mrs. has got dem bills, said Chloe, anxiously. Yes, Chloe, 'cause I wants to show my old man dem very bills the perfectioner gave me, and say he, Chloe, I wish you'd stay longer. Thanked you, masser, says I would, only my old man's coming home, and Mrs. she can't do without me no longer. There's just what I telled him. Very nice man, dat Masser Jones was. Chloe had pertinaciously insisted that the very bills in which her wages had been paid should be preserved, to show her husband in memorial of her capability, and Mrs. Shelby had readily consented to humor her in the request. He won't know, Polly. My old man won't. Laws, it's 5 years since they tuck him. She was a baby den, couldn't but just stand. Remember how tickled he used to be, 'cause she would keep a fallin' over when she sought out to walk. Laws a me, the rattling of wheels now was heard. Masser George, said Aunt Chloe, starting to the window. Mrs. Shelby ran to the entry door and was folded in the arms of her son. Aunt Chloe stood anxiously straining her eyes out into the darkness. Oh, poor Aunt Chloe, said George, stopping compassionately and taking her hard, black hand between both his. I'd have given all my fortune to have brought him with me, but he's gone to a better country. There was a passionate exclamation from Mrs. Shelby, but Aunt Chloe said nothing. The party entered the supper room. The money, of which Chloe was so proud, was still lying on the table. Thar, said she, gathering it up and holding it with a trembling hand to her mistress, don't never want to see nor hear on tea again. Just as I knew tea would be sold and murdered on dem our old plantations. Chloe turned and was walking proudly out of the room. Mrs. Shelby followed her softly and took one of her hands, drew her down into a chair, and sat down by her. My poor, good Chloe, said she. Chloe leaned her head on her mistress' shoulder and sobbed out, Oh, Missus, 'scuse me, my heart's broke, dat's all. I know it is, said Mrs. Shelby as her tears fell fast, and I cannot heal it, but Jesus can. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. There was a silence for some time, and all wept together. At last, George, sitting down beside the mourner, took her hand and, with simple pathos, repeated the triumphant scene of her husband's death and his last messages of love. About a month after this, one morning, all the servants of the Shelby estate were convened together in the great hall that ran through the house to hear a few words from their young master. To the surprise of all, he appeared among them with a bundle of papers in his hand, containing a certificate of freedom to every one on the place, which he read successively and presented amid the sobs and tears and shouts of all present. Many, however, pressed around him, earnestly begging him not to send them away, and with anxious faces tendering back their free papers. We don't want to be no freer than we are. We's allers had all we wanted. We don't want to leave de old place and masser and missus and de rest. My good friends, said George as soon as he could get a silence, there'll be no need for you to leave me. The place wants as many hands to work it as it did before. We need the same about the house that we did before. But you are now free men and free women. I shall pay you wages for your work, such as we shall agree on. The advantage is that, in case of my getting in debt or dying, things that may happen, you cannot now be taken up and sold. I expect to carry on the estate and to teach you what. Perhaps it will take you some time to learn how to use the rights I give you as free men and women. I expect you to be good and willing to learn, and I trust in God that I shall be faithful and willing to teach. And now, my friends, look up and thank God for the blessing of freedom. An aged, patriarchal Negro who had grown gray and blind on the estate now rose and, lifting his trembling hand, said, "Let us give thanks unto the Lord." As all kneeled by one consent, a more touching and hearty Te Deum never ascended to heaven, though borne on the peal of organ, bell, and cannon, than came from that honest old heart. On rising, another struck up a Methodist hymn, of which the burden was, "The year of Jubilee is come, return, ye ransomed sinners, home." One thing more, said George, as he stopped the congratulations of the throng. You all remember our good old Uncle Tom? George here gave a short narration of the scene of his death, and of his loving farewell to all on the place, and added, "It was on his grave, my friends, that I resolved before God that I would never own another slave while it was possible to free him, that nobody, through me, should ever run the risk of being parted from home and friends and dying on a lonely plantation as he died. So, when you rejoice in your freedom, think that you owe it to that good old soul, and pay it back in kindness to his wife and children." Chapter Roman 45. Concluding Remarks. The writer has often been inquired of by correspondents from different parts of the country whether this narrative is a true one, and to these inquiries she will give one general answer. The separate incidents that compose the narrative are, to a very great extent, authentic, occurring, many of them, either under her own observation or that of her personal friends. She or her friends have observed characters the counterpart of almost all that are here introduced, and many of the sayings are word for word as heard herself or reported to her. The personal appearance of Eliza, the character ascribed to her, are sketches drawn from life. The incorruptible fidelity, piety, and honesty of Uncle Tom had more than one development to her personal knowledge. Some of the most deeply tragic and romantic, some of the most terrible incidents have also their parallels in reality. The incident of the mothers crossing the Ohio River on the ice is a well-known fact. The story of Old Prue in the second volume was an incident that fell under the personal observation of a brother of the writer, then collecting clerk to a large mercantile house in New Orleans. From the same source was derived the character of the planter Legree. Of him her brother thus wrote, speaking of visiting his plantation on a collecting tour: "He actually made me feel of his fist, which was like a blacksmith's hammer or a nodule of iron, telling me that it was calloused with knocking down niggers. When I left the plantation, I drew a long breath and felt as if I had escaped from an ogre's den." that the tragical fate of Tom also has too many times had its parallel. There are living witnesses all over our land to testify. Let it be remembered that in all southern states it is a principle of jurisprudence that no person of colored lineage can testify in a suit against a white, and it will be easy to see that such a case may occur wherever there is a man whose passions outweigh his interests and a slave who has manhood or principle enough to resist his will. There is, actually, nothing to protect the slave's life but the character of the master. Facts too shocking to be contemplated occasionally force their way to the public ear, and the comment that one often hears made on them is more shocking than the thing itself. It is said, very likely, such cases may now and then occur, but they are no sample of general practice. If the laws of New England were so arranged that a master could now and then torture an apprentice to death, would it be received with equal composure? Would it be said these cases are rare and no samples of general practice? This injustice is an inherent one in the slave system. It cannot exist without it. The public and shameless sale of beautiful mulatto and quadroon girls has acquired a notoriety from the incidents following the capture of the Pearl. We extract the following from the speech of Hon. Horace Mann, one of the legal counsel for the defendants in that case. He says, in that company of 76 persons who attempted, in 1848, to escape from the District of Columbia in the schooner Pearl, and whose officers I assisted in defending, there were several young and healthy girls who had those peculiar attractions of form and feature which connoisseurs prize so highly. Elizabeth Russell was one of them. She immediately fell into the slave trader's fangs and was doomed for the New Orleans market. The hearts of those that saw her were touched with pity for her fate. They offered $1,800 to redeem her, and some there were who offered to give that would not have much left after the gift. But the fiend of a slave trader was inexorable. She was dispatched to New Orleans, but when about halfway there, God had mercy on her and smote her with death. There were two girls named Edmondson in the same company. When about to be sent to the same market, an older sister went to the shambles to plead with the wretch who owned them for the love of God to spare his victims. He bantered her, telling what fine dresses and fine furniture they would have. Yes, she said, that may do very well in this life, but what will become of them in the next? They too were sent to New Orleans, but were afterwards redeemed at an enormous ransom and brought back. Is it not plain from this that the histories of Emmeline and Cassie may have many counterparts? Justice, too, obliges the author to state that the fairness of mind and generosity attributed to St. Clair are not without a parallel, as the following anecdote will show. A few years since, a young Southern gentleman was in Cincinnati with a favorite servant who had been his personal attendant from a boy. The young man took advantage of this opportunity to secure his own freedom and fled to the protection of a Quaker who was quite noted in affairs of this kind. The owner was exceedingly indignant. He had always treated the slave with such indulgence, and his confidence in his affection was such that he believed he must have been practiced upon to induce him to revolt from him. He visited the Quaker in high anger, but being possessed of uncommon candor and fairness, was soon quieted by his arguments and representations. It was a side of the subject which he never had heard, never had thought on, and he immediately told the Quaker that, if his slave would, to his own face, say that it was his desire to be free, he would liberate him. An interview was immediately procured, and Nathan was asked by his young master whether he had ever had any reason to complain of his treatment in any respect. No, masser, said Nathan, you've always been good to me. Well, then, why do you want to leave me? Masser may die, and then who get me? I'd rather be a free man. After some deliberation, the young master replied, Nathan, in your place, I think I should feel very much so, myself. You are free. He immediately made him out free papers, deposited a sum of money in the hands of the Quaker, to be judiciously used in assisting him to start in life, and left a very sensible and kind letter of advice to the young man. That letter was for some time in the writer's hands. The author hopes she has done justice to that nobility, generosity, and humanity which in many cases characterize individuals at the South. Such instances save us from utter despair of our kind. But she asks any person who knows the world, are such characters common anywhere? For many years of her life, the author avoided all reading upon or allusion to the subject of slavery, considering it as too painful to be inquired into, and one which advancing light and civilization would certainly live down. But, since the Legislative Act of 1850, when she heard, with perfect surprise and consternation, Christian and humane people actually recommending the remanding escaped fugitives into slavery as a duty binding on good citizens, when she heard, on all hands, from kind, compassionate, and estimable people in the free states of the North, deliberations and discussions as to what Christian duty could be on this head, she could only think these men and Christians cannot know what slavery is. If they did, such a question could never be open for discussion, and from this arose a desire to exhibit it in a living dramatic reality. She has endeavored to show it fairly, in its best and its worst phases. In its best aspect she has, perhaps, been successful, but oh, who shall say what yet remains untold in that valley and shadow of death that lies the other side? To you, generous, noble-minded men and women of the South, you whose virtue and magnanimity and purity of character are the greater for the severe trial it has encountered, to you is her appeal. Have you not, in your own secret souls, in your own private conversing,s felt that there are woes and evils in this accursed system far beyond what are here shadowed or can be shadowed? Can it be otherwise? Is man ever a creature to be trusted with wholly irresponsible power? And does not the slave system, by denying the slave all legal right of testimony, make every individual owner an irresponsible despot? Can anybody fall to make the inference what the practical result will be if there is, as we admit, a public sentiment among you, men of honor, justice, and humanity? Is there not also another kind of public sentiment among the ruffian, the brutal, and debased? And cannot the ruffian, the brutal, the debased, by slave law, own just as many slaves as the best and purest? Are the honorable, the just, the high-minded and compassionate, the majority, anywhere in this world? The slave trade is now, by American law, considered as piracy. But a slave trade, as systematic as ever was carried on the coast of Africa, is an inevitable attendant and result of American slavery, and its heartbreak and its horrors, can they be told? The writer has given only a faint shadow, a dim picture of the anguish and despair that are, at this very moment, riving thousands of hearts, shattering thousands of families, and driving a helpless and sensitive race to frenzy and despair. There are those living who know the mothers whom this accursed traffic has driven to the murder of their children, and themselves seeking in death a shelter from woes more dreaded than death. Nothing of tragedy can be written, can be spoken, can be conceived, that equals the frightful reality of scenes daily and hourly acting on our shores beneath the shadow of American law and the shadow of the cross of Christ. And now, men and women of America, is this a thing to be trifled with, apologized for, and passed over in silence? Farmers of Massachusetts, of New Hampshire, of Vermont, of Connecticut, who read this book by the blaze of your winter evening fire, strong-hearted, generous sailors, and shipowners of Maine, is this a thing for you to countenance? And a courage, brave and generous men of New York, farmers of rich and joyous Ohio, and ye of the wide prairie states, answer, is this a thing for you to protect and countenance? And you, mothers of America, you who have learned, by the cradles of your own children, to love and feel for all mankind, by the sacred love you bear your child, by your joy in his beautiful, spotless infancy, by the motherly pity and tenderness with which you guide his growing years, by the anxieties of his education, by the prayers you breathe for his soul's eternal good, I beseech you, pity the mother who has all your affections and not one legal right to protect, guide, or educate the child of her bosom. By the sick hour of your child, by those dying eyes which you can never forget, by those last cries that wrung your heart when you could neither help nor save, by the desolation of that empty cradle, that silent nursery, I beseech you, pity those mothers that are constantly made childless by the American slave trade, and say, mothers of America, is this a thing to be defended, sympathized with, passed over in silence? Do you say that the people of the Free State have nothing to do with it, and can do nothing? Would to God this were true. But it is not true. The people of the Free States have defended, encouraged, and participated, and are more guilty for it, before God, than the South, in that they have not the apology of education or custom. If the mothers of the Free States had all felt as they should in times past, the sons of the Free States would not have been the holders and, proverbially, the hardest masters of slaves. The sons of the Free States would not have connived at the extension of slavery in our national body. The sons of the Free States would not, as they do, trade the souls and bodies of men as an equivalent to money in their mercantile dealings. There are multitudes of slaves temporarily owned and sold again by merchants in northern cities, and shall the whole guilt or obloquy of slavery fall only on the South? Northern men, northern mothers, northern Christians have something more to do than denounce their brethren at the South. They have to look to the evil among themselves. But what can any individual do? Of that every individual can judge. There is one thing that every individual can do. They can see to it that they feel right. An atmosphere of sympathetic influence encircles every human being, and the man or woman who feels strongly, healthily, and justly on the great interests of humanity is a constant benefactor to the human race. See, then, to your sympathies in this matter. Are they in harmony with the sympathies of Christ? Or are they swayed and perverted by the sophistries of worldly policy? Christian men and women of the North. Still further, you have another power. You can pray! Do you believe in prayer, or has it become an indistinct apostolic tradition? You pray for the heathen abroad. Pray also for the heathen at home, and pray for those distressed Christians whose whole chance of religious improvement is an accident of trade and sale, from whom any adherence to the morals of Christianity is in many cases an impossibility unless they have given them from above the courage and grace of martyrdom. But still more, on the shores of our Free States are emerging the poor, shattered, broken remnants of families, men and women, escaped by miraculous providences from the surges of slavery, feeble in knowledge, and in many cases infirm in moral constitution, from a system which confounds and confuses every principle of Christianity and morality. They come to seek a refuge among you. They come to seek education, knowledge, Christianity. What do you owe to these poor unfortunates, O Christians? Does not every American Christian owe to the African race some effort at reparation for the wrongs that the American nation has brought upon them? Shall the doors of churches and schoolhouses be shut upon them? Shall states arise and shake them out? Shall the Church of Christ hear in silence the taunt that is thrown at them, and shrink away from the helpless hand that they stretch out, and by her silence encourage the cruelty that would chase them from our borders? If it must be so, it will be a mournful spectacle. If it must be so, the country will have reason to tremble when it remembers that the fate of nations is in the hands of one who is very pitiful and of tender compassion. Do you say, we don't want them here, let them go to Africa? That the providence of God has provided a refuge in Africa is truly a great and noticeable fact, but that is no reason why the Church of Christ should throw off that responsibility to this outcast race which her profession demands of her. To fill up Liberia with an ignorant, inexperienced, half-barbarized race just escaped from the chains of slavery would be only to prolong for ages the period of struggle and conflict which attends the inception of new enterprises. Let the Church of the North receive these poor sufferers in the spirit of Christ, receive them to the educating advantages of Christian Republican society and schools until they have attained to somewhat of a moral and intellectual maturity, and then assist them in their passage to those shores where they may put in practice the lessons they have learned in America. There is a body of men at the North, comparatively small, who have been doing this, and as the result, this country has already seen examples of men, formerly slaves, who have rapidly acquired property, reputation, and education. Talent has been developed, which, considering the circumstances, is certainly remarkable, and for moral traits of honesty, kindness, tenderness of feeling, for heroic efforts and self-denials endured for the ransom of brethren and friends yet in slavery, they have been remarkable to a degree that, considering the influence under which they were born, is surprising. The writer has lived for many years on the frontier line of slave states and has had great opportunities of observation among those who formerly were slaves. They have been in her family as servants, and in default of any other school to receive them, she has, in many cases, had them instructed in a family school with her own children. She has also the testimony of missionaries among the fugitives in Canada, in coincidence with her own experience, and her deductions with regard to the capabilities of the race are encouraging in the highest degree. The first desire of the emancipated slave, generally, is for education. There is nothing that they are not willing to give or do to have their children instructed, and so far as the writer has observed herself, or taken the testimony of teachers among them, they are remarkably intelligent and quick to learn. The results of schools, founded for them by benevolent individuals in Cincinnati, fully establish this. The author gives the following statement of facts on the authority of Professor C. E. Stowe, then of Lane Seminary, Ohio, with regard to emancipated slaves now resident in Cincinnati, given to show the capability of the race, evening without any very particular assistance or encouragement. The initial letters alone are given. They are all residents of Cincinnati. B. Furniture maker, 20 years in the city, worth $10,000, all his own earnings, a Baptist. C. Full black, stolen from Africa, sold in New Orleans, been free 15 years, paid for himself $600, a farmer, owns several farms in Indiana, Presbyterian, probably worth $15,000 or $20,000, all earned by himself. K. Full black, dealer in real estate, worth $30,000, about 40 years old, free 6 years, paid $1,800 for his family, member of the Baptist Church, received a legacy from his master, which he has taken good care of and increased. G. Full black, coal dealer, about 30 years old, worth $18,000, paid for himself twice, being once defrauded to the amount of $1,600, made all his money by his own efforts, much of it while a slave, hiring his time of his master, and doing business for himself, a fine, gentlemanly fellow. W. 3/4 black, barber and waiter, from Kentucky, 19 years free, paid for self and family over $3,000, deacon in the Baptist Church. G. D. 3/4 black, whitewasher, from Kentucky, 9 years free, paid $1,500 for self and family, recently died, aged 60, worth $6,000. Professor Stowe says, with all these, except G, I have been, for some years, personally acquainted and make my statements from my own knowledge. The writer well remembers an aged colored woman who was employed as a washerwoman in her father's family. The daughter of this woman married a slave. She was a remarkably active and capable young woman, and by her industry and thrift and the most persevering self-denial raised $900 for her husband's freedom, which she paid as she raised it into the hands of his master. She yet wanted $100 of the price when he died. She never recovered any of the money. These are but few facts among multitudes which may be deduced to show the self-denial, energy, patience, and honesty which the slave has exhibited in a state of freedom. And let it be remembered that these individuals have thus bravely succeeded in conquering for themselves comparative wealth and social position in the face of every disadvantage and discouragement. The colored man, by the law of Ohio, cannot be a voter, and till within a few years was even denied the right of testimony in legal suits with the white. Nor are these instances confined to the state of Ohio. In all states of the Union we see men, but yesterday burst from the shackles of slavery, who, by a self-educating force which cannot be too much admired, have risen to highly respectable stations in society. Pennington among clergymen, Douglas and Ward among editors are well known instances. If this persecuted race, with every discouragement and disadvantage, have done thus much, how much more they may do if the Christian Church would act towards them in the spirit of her Lord. This is an age of the world when nations are trembling and convulsed. A mighty influence is abroad, surging and heaving the world as with an earthquake. And is America safe? Every nation that carries in its bosom great and unredressed injustice has in it the elements of this last convulsion. For what is this mighty influence thus rousing in all nations and languages those groanings that cannot be uttered for man's freedom and equality? O Church of Christ, read the signs of the times. Is not this power the spirit of him whose kingdom is yet to come, and whose will to be done on earth as it is in heaven? But who may abide the day of his appearing? For that day shall burn as an oven, and he shall appear as a swift witness against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger in his right, and he shall break in pieces the oppressor. Are not these dread words for a nation bearing in her bosom so mighty an injustice? Christians, every time that you pray that the kingdom of Christ may come, can you forget that prophecy associates in dread fellowship the day of vengeance with the year of his redeemed? A day of grace is yet held out to us. Both North and South have been guilty before God, and the Christian Church has a heavy account to answer. Chapter 46. Marian's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow, and with youth, natural strength, and her mother's presence in aid, it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove, within 4 days after the arrival of the latter, into Mrs. Palmer's dressing room. When there, at her own particular request, for she was impatient to pour forth her thanks to him for fetching her mother, Colonel Brandon was invited to visit her. His emotion on entering the room, in seeing her altered looks, and in receiving the pale hand which she'd immediately held out to him, was such as in Eleanor's conjecture must arise from something more than his affection for Marian, or the consciousness of its being known to others, and she soon discovered in his melancholy eye and varying complexion as he looked at her sister the probable recurrence of many past scenes of misery to his mind, brought back by that resemblance between Marian and Eliza already acknowledged, and now strengthened by the hollow eye, the sickly skin, the posture of reclining weakness, and the warm acknowledgment of peculiar obligation. Mrs. Dashwood, not less watchful of what passed than her daughter, but with a mind very differently influenced, and therefore watching to very different effect, saw nothing in the Colonel's behavior but what arose from the most simple and self-evident sensations, while in the actions and words of Marian she persuaded herself to think that something more than gratitude already dawned. At the end of another day or two, Marian growing visibly stronger, every 12 hours, Mrs. Dashwood, urged equally by her own and her daughter's wishes, began to talk of removing to Barton. On her measures depended those of her two friends. Mrs. Jennings could not quit Cleveland during the Dashwoods' stay, and Colonel Brandon was soon brought by their united request to consider his own abode there as equally determinate, if not equally indispensable. At his and Mrs. Jennings's united request in return, Mrs. Dashwood was prevailed on to accept the use of his carriage on her journey back for the better accommodation of her sick child, and the Colonel, at the joint invitation of Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. Jennings, whose active good nature made her friendly and hospitable for other people as well as herself, engaged with pleasure to redeem it by a visit at the cottage in the course of a few weeks. The day of separation and departure arrived, and Marian, after taking so particular and lengthened a leave of Mrs. Jennings, one so earnestly grateful, so full of respect and kind wishes as seemed due to her own heart from a secret acknowledgment of past inattention, and bidding Colonel Brandon farewell with the cordiality of a friend, was carefully assisted by him into the carriage, of which he seemed anxious that she should engross at least half. Mrs. Dashwood and Elinor then followed, and the others were left by themselves to talk of the travellers and feel their own dullness, till Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise to take comfort in the gossip of her maid for the loss of her two young companions, and Colonel Brandon immediately afterwards took his solitary way to Delaford. The Dashwoods were 2 days on the road, and Marian bore her journey on both without essential fatigue. Everything that the most zealous affection, the most solicitous care could do to render her comfortable, was the office of each watchful companion, and each found their reward in her bodily ease and her calmness of spirits. To Elinor, the observation of the latter was particularly grateful. She, who had seen her week after week so constantly suffering, oppressed by anguish of heart which she had neither courage to speak of, nor fortitude to conceal, now saw with a joy which no other could equally share, an apparent composure of mind, which, in being the result, as she trusted, of serious reflection, must eventually lead her to contentment and cheerfulness. As they approached Barton, truly, and entered on scenes of which every field and every tree brought some peculiar, some painful recollection, she grew silent and thoughtful, and turning away her face from their notice, sat earnestly gazing through the window. But here Elinor could neither wonder nor blame, and when she saw, as she assisted Marian from the carriage, that she had been crying, she saw only an emotion too natural in itself to raise anything less tender than pity, and in its unobtrusiveness entitled to praise. In the whole of her subsequent manner, she traced the direction of a mind awakened to reasonable exertion, for no sooner had they entered their common sitting-room than Marian turned her eyes around it with a look of resolute firmness, as if determined at once to accustom herself to the sight of every object with which the remembrance of Willoughby could be connected. She said little, but every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, and though a sigh sometimes escaped her, it never passed away without the atonement of a smile. After dinner she would try her pianoforte. She went to it, but the music on which her eye first rested was an opera procured for her by Willoughby, containing some of their favorite duets, and bearing on its outward leaf her own name in his handwriting. That would not do. She shook her head, put the music aside, and after running over the keys for a minute, complained of feebleness in her fingers, and closed the instrument again, declaring, however, with firmness as she did so, that she should in future practice much. The next morning produced no abatement in these happy symptoms. On the contrary, with a mind and body alike strengthened by rest, she looked, and spoke with more genuine spirit, anticipating the pleasure of Margaret's return, and talking of the dear family party which would then be restored, of their mutual pursuits and cheerful society, as the only happiness worth a wish. When the weather is settled and I have recovered my strength, said she, we will take long walks together every day. We will walk to the farm at the edge of the down and see how the children go on. We will walk to Sir John's new plantations at Barton Cross and the Abilene, and we will often go the old ruins of the Priory and try to trace its foundations as far as we are told they once reached. I know we shall be happy. I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean never to be later in rising than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I have formed my plan, and am determined to enter on a course of serious study. Our own library is too well known to me to be resorted to for anything beyond mere amusement. But there are many works well worth reading at the park, and there are others of more modern production which I know I can borrow of Colonel Brandon. By reading only 6 hours a day, I shall gain in the course of a 12-month a great deal of instruction which I now feel myself to want. Elinor honored her for a plan which originated so nobly as this, though smiling to see the same eager fancy which had been leading her to the extreme of languid indolence and selfish repining now at work in introducing excess into a scheme of such rational employment and virtuous self-control. Her smile, however, changed to a sigh when she remembered that promise to Willoughby was yet unfulfilled, and feared she had that to communicate which may again unsettle the mind of Marian, and ruin at least for a time this fair prospect of busy tranquillity. Willing therefore to delay the evil hour, she resolved to wait till her sister's health were more secure before she appointed it. But the resolution was made only to be broken. Marian had been 2 or 3 days at home before the weather was fine enough for an invalid like herself to venture out. But at last a soft, genial morning appeared, such as may tempt the daughter's wishes and the mother's confidence, and Marian, leaning on Elinor's arm, was authorized to walk as long as she could without fatigue in the lane before the house. The sisters set out at a pace slow as the feebleness of Marian in an exercise hitherto untried since her illness required, and they had advanced only so far beyond the house as to admit a full view of the important hill behind, when pausing with her eyes turned towards it, Marian calmly said, there, exactly there, pointing with one hand on that projecting mound, there I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby. Her voice sunk with the word, but soon reviving she added, I am thankful to find that I can look with so little pain on the spot. Shall we ever talk on that subject, Elinor? Hesitatingly it was said. Or will it be wrong? I can talk of it now, I hope, as I ought to do. Elinor tenderly invited her to be open. As for regret, said Marian, I have done with that as far as he is concerned. I do not mean to talk to you of what my feelings have been for him, but what they are now. At present, if I could be satisfied on one point, if I could be allowed to think that he was not always acting a part, not always deceiving me, but above all, if I could be assured that he never was so very wicked as my fears have sometimes fancied him. Since the story of that unfortunate girl, she stopped. Elinor joyfully treasured her words as she answered, if you could be assured of that, you think you should be easy. Yes, my peace of mind is doubly involved in it. For not only is it horrible to suspect a person who has been what he has been to me of such designs, but what must it make me appear to myself? What in a situation like mine, but a most shamefully unguarded affection could expose me to? How then, asked her sister, would you account for his behavior? I would suppose him, oh, how gladly would I suppose him, only fickle, very, very fickle. Elinor said no more. She was debating within herself on the eligibility of beginning her story directly, or postponing it till Marian were in stronger health, and they crept on for a few minutes, in silence. I am not wishing him too much good, said Marian at last with a sigh, when I wish his secret reflections may be no more unpleasant than my own. He will suffer enough in them. Do you compare your conduct with his? No, I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours. Our situations have borne little resemblance. They have borne more than our conduct. Do not, my dearest Elinor, let your kindness defend what I know your judgment must censure. My illness has made me think. It has given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behavior, since the beginning of our acquaintance with him last autumn, nothing but a series of imprudence towards myself and want of kindness to others. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings, and that my want of fortitude under them had almost led me to the grave. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought on by myself by such negligence of my own health as I had felt evening at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction. I did not know my danger till the danger was removed, but with such feelings as these reflections gave me, I wonder at my recovery, wonder that the very eagerness of my desire to live, to have time for atonement to my God and to you all, did not kill me at once. Had I died, in what peculiar misery should I have left you, my nurse, my friend, my sister, you, who had seen all the fretful selfishness of my latter days, who had known all the murmurings of my heart? How should I have lived in your remembrance? My mother, too, how could you have consoled her? I cannot express my own abhorrence of myself. Whenever I looked towards the past, I saw some duty neglected or some failing indulged. Everybody seemed injured by me. The kindness, the unceasing kindness of Mrs. Jennings, I had repaid with ungrateful contempt to the Middletons, to the Palmers, the Steeles, to every common acquaintance evening. I had been insolent and unjust, with a heart hardened against their merits, and a temper irritated by their very attention to John, to Fanny, yes, evening to them, little as they deserve. I had given less than their due, but you above all, above my mother, had been wronged by me. I, and only I, knew your heart and its sorrows, yet to what did it influence me? Not to any compassion that could benefit you or myself. Your example was before me, but to what avail? Was I more considerate of you and your comfort? Did I imitate your forbearance or lessen your restraints by taking any part in those offices of general complaisance or particular gratitude which you had hitherto been left to discharge alone? No, not less when I knew you to be unhappy than when I had believed you at ease. Did I turn away from every exertion of duty or friendship, scarcely allowing sorrow to exist but with me, regretting only that heart which had deserted and wronged me, and leaving you, for whom I professed an unbounded affection, to be miserable for my sake? Here ceased the rapid flow of her self-reproving spirit, and Elinor, impatient to soothe, though too honest to flatter, gave her instantly that praise and support which her frankness and her contrition so well deserved. Marian pressed her hand and replied, "You are very good. The future must be my proof. I have laid down my plan, and if I am capable of adhering to it, my feelings shall be governed and my temper improved. They shall no longer worry others, nor torture myself. I shall now live solely for my family. You, my mother, and Margaret must henceforth be all the world to me. You will share my affections entirely between you. From my home, I shall never again have the smallest incitement to move, and if I do mix in other society, it will be only to show that my spirit is humbled, my heart amended, and that I can practice the civilities, the lesser duties of life, with gentleness and forbearance. As for Willoughby, to say that I shall soon or that I shall ever forget him would be idle. his remembrance can be overcome by no change of circumstances or opinions. But it shall be regulated, it shall be checked by religion, by reason, by constant employment. She paused and added in a low voice, if I could but know his heart, everything would become easy. Elinor, who had now been for some time reflecting on the propriety or impropriety of speedily hazarding her narration, without feeling at all nearer decision than at first, heard this, and perceiving that, as reflection did nothing, resolution must do all, soon found herself leading to the fact. She managed the recital, as she hoped, with address, prepared her anxious listener with caution, related simply and honestly the chief points on which Willoughby grounded his apology, did justice to his repentance, and softened only his protestations of present regard. Marian said not a word. She trembled, her eyes were fixed on the ground, and her lips became whiter than evening sickness had left them. A thousand inquiries sprung up from her heart, but she dared not urge one. She caught every syllable with panting eagerness. Her hand, unknowingly to herself, closely pressed her sister's, and tears covered her cheeks. Elinor, dreading her being tired, led her towards home, until they reached the door of the cottage, easily conjecturing what her curiosity must be, though no question was suffered to speak it, talked of nothing but Willoughby and their conversation together, and was carefully minute in every particular of speech and look, where minuteness could be safely indulged. As soon as they entered the house, Marian, with a kiss of gratitude and these two words just articulate through her tears, "Tell mamma," withdrew from her sister and walked slowly up stairs. Chapter 47. Mrs. Dashwood did not hear unmoved the vindication of her former favorite. She rejoiced in his being cleared from some part of his imputed guilt. She was sorry for him. She wished him happy. But the feelings of the past could not be recalled. Nothing could restore him, with a faith unbroken, a character unblemished, to Marian. Nothing could do away the knowledge of what the latter had suffered through his means, nor remove the guilt of his conduct towards Eliza. Nothing could replace him, therefore, in her former esteem, nor injure the interests of Colonel Brandon. Had Mrs. Dashwood, like her daughter, heard Willoughby's story from himself, had she witnessed his distress and been under the influence of his countenance and his manner, it is probable that her compassion would have been greater, but it was neither in Elinor's power nor in her wish to rouse such feelings in another by her retailed explanation, as had at first been called forth in herself. Reflection had given calmness to her judgment and sobered her own opinion of Willoughby's deserts. She wished, therefore, to declare only the simple truth, and lay open such facts as were really due to his character, without any embellishment of tenderness to lead the fancy astray. In the evening, when they were all three together, Marian began voluntarily to speak of him again, but that it was not without an effort. The restless, unquiet thoughtfulness in which she had been for some time previously sitting, her rising color as she spoke, and her unsteady voice plainly showed. "I wish to assure you both," said she, "that I see everything as you can desire me to do." Mrs. Dashwood would have interrupted her instantly with soothing tenderness, had not Elinor, who really wished to hear her sister's unbiased opinion, by an eager sign, engaged her silence. Marian slowly continued, "It is a great relief to me. What Elinor told me this morning, I have now heard exactly what I wished to hear." For some moments her voice was lost, but recovering herself, she added, and with greater calmness than before, "I am now perfectly satisfied. I wish for no change. I never could have been happy with him after knowing, as sooner or later I must have known all this. I should have had no confidence, no esteem. Nothing could have done it away to my feelings. I know it, I know it," cried her mother. "Happy with a man of libertine practices, with one who so injured the peace of the dearest of our friends and the best of men." No, my Marian has not a heart to be made happy with such a man. Her conscience, her sensitive conscience, would have felt all that the conscience of her husband ought to have felt. Marian sighed and repeated, I wish for no change. You consider the matter, said Elinor, exactly as a good mind and a sound understanding must consider it, and I dare say you perceive, as well as myself, not only in this, but in many other circumstances, reason enough to be convinced that your marriage must have involved you in many certain troubles and disappointments, in which you would have been poorly supported by an affection, on his side, much less certain. Had you married, you must have been always poor. His expensiveness is acknowledged evening by himself, and his whole conduct declares that self-denial is a word hardly understood by him. His demands and your inexperience together, on a small, very small income, must have brought on distresses which would not be the less grievous to you from having been entirely unknown and unthought of before. Your sense of honor and honesty would have led you, I know, when aware of your situation, to attempt all the economy that would appear to you possible, and perhaps, as long as your frugality retrenched only on your own comfort, you may have been suffered to practice it, but beyond that, and how little could the utmost of your single management do to stop the ruin which had begun before your marriage. Beyond that, had you endeavored, however reasonably, to abridge his enjoyments, is it not to be feared that instead of prevailing on feelings so selfish to consent to it, you would have lessened your own influence on his heart, and made him regret the connection which had involved him in such difficulties? Marian's lips quivered, and she repeated the word selfish in a tone that implied, do you really think him selfish? The whole of his behavior, replied Elinor, from the beginning to the end of the affair, has been grounded on selfishness. It was selfishness which first made him sport with your affections, which afterwards, when his own were engaged, made him delay the confession of it, and which finally carried him from Barton. His own enjoyment, or his own ease, was in every particular his ruling principle. It is very true, my happiness never was his object. At present, continued Elinor, he regrets what he has done. And why does he regret it? Because he finds it has not answered towards himself. It has not made him happy. His circumstances are now unembarrassed. He suffers from no evil of that kind, and he thinks only that he has married a woman of a less amiable temper than yourself. But does it follow that had he married you, he would have been happy? The inconveniences would have been different. He would then have suffered under the pecuniary distresses which, because they are removed, he now reckons as nothing. He would have had a wife of whose temper he could make no complaint, but he would have been always necessitous, always poor, and probably would soon have learned to rank the innumerable comforts of a clear estate and good income as of far more importance, evening to domestic happiness, than the mere temper of a wife. I have not a doubt of it, said Marian, and I have nothing to regret, nothing but my own folly. Rather say your mother's imprudence, my child, said Mrs. Dashwood. She must be answerable. Marian would not let her proceed, and Elinor, satisfied that each felt their own error, wished to avoid any survey of the past that may weaken her sister's spirits. She, therefore, pursuing the first subject, immediately continued, one observation may, I think, be fairly drawn from the whole of the story, that all Willoughby's difficulties have arisen from the first offense against virtue in his behavior to Eliza Williams. That crime has been the origin of every lesser one, and of all his present discontents. Marian assented most feelingly to the remark, and her mother was led by it to an enumeration of Colonel Brandon's injuries and merits, warm as friendship and design could unitedly dictate. Her daughter did not look, however, as if much of it were heard by her. Elinor, according to her expectation, saw on the 2 or 3 following days that Marian did not continue to gain strength as she had done, but while her resolution was unsubdued, and she still tried to appear cheerful and easy, her sister could safely trust to the defective time. Upon her health, Margaret returned, and the family were again all restored to each other, again quietly settled at the cottage, and if not pursuing their usual studies with quite so much vigor as when they first came to Barton, at least planning a vigorous prosecution of them in future. Elinor grew impatient for some tidings of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leaving London, nothing new of his plans, nothing certain evening of his present abode. Some letters had passed between her and her brother in consequence of Marian's illness, and in the first of John's there had been this sentence: "We know nothing of our unfortunate Edward, and can make no inquiries on so prohibited a subject, but conclude him to be still at Oxford," which was all the intelligence of Edward afforded her by the correspondence, for his name was not even mentioned in any of the succeeding letters. She was not doomed, however, to be long in ignorance of his measures. Their manservant had been sent one morning to Exeter on business, and when, as he waited at table, he had satisfied the inquiries of his mistress as to the event of his errand, this was his voluntary communication: "I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferrars is married." Marian gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Elinor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. Mrs. Dashwood, whose eyes, as she answered the servant's inquiry, had intuitively taken the same direction, was shocked to perceive by Elinor's countenance how much she really suffered, and a moment afterwards, alike distressed by Marian's situation, knew not on which child to bestow her principal attention. The servant, who saw only that Miss Marian was taken ill, had sense enough to call one of the maids, who, with Mrs. Dashwood's assistance, supported her into the other room. By that time, Marian was rather better, and her mother, leaving her to the care of Margaret and the maid, returned to Elinor, who, though still much disordered, had so far recovered the use of her reason and voice as to be just beginning an inquiry of Thomas as to the source of his intelligence. Mrs. Dashwood immediately took all that trouble on herself, and Elinor had the benefit of the information without the exertion of seeking it. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas?" "I see Mr. Ferrars myself, ma'am, this morning in Exeter, and his lady, too, Miss Steele, as was. They was stopping in a chaise at the door of the New London Inn, as I went there with a message from Sally at the Park to her brother, who is one of the post boys. I happened to look up as I went by the chaise, and so I see directly it was the youngest Miss Steele, so I took off my hat, and she knew me and called to me, and inquired after you, ma'am, and the young ladies, especially Miss Marian, and bid me I should give her compliments and Mr. Ferrars's their best compliments and service, and how sorry they was they had not time to come on and see you, but they was in a great hurry to go forwards, for they was going further down for a little while, but howser, when they come back, they'd make sure to come and see you." "But did she tell you she was married, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am." She smiled, and said how she had changed her name since she was in these parts. She was always a very affable and free-spoken young lady, and very civil behaved. So I made free to wish her joy. "Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her?" "Yes, ma'am. I just see him leaning back in it, but he did not look up. He never was a gentleman much for talking." Elinor's heart could easily account for his not putting himself forward, and Mrs. Dashwood probably found the same explanation. "Was there no one else in the carriage?" "No, ma'am, only they two." "Do you know where they came from?" "They come straight from town, as Miss Lucy, Mrs. Ferrars told me." "And are they going farther westward?" "Yes, ma'am, but not to bide long. They will soon be back again, and then they'd be sure and call here." Mrs. Dashwood now looked at her daughter, but Elinor knew better than to expect them. She recognized the whole of Lucy in the message, and was very confident that Edward would never come near them. She observed in a low voice to her mother that they were probably going down to Mr. Pratt's near Plymouth. Thomas's intelligence seemed over. Elinor looked as if she wished to hear more. Did you see them off before you came away? No, ma'am, the horses were just coming out, but I could not bide any longer. I was afraid of being late. Did Mrs. Ferrars look well? Yes, ma'am. She said how she was very well, and to my mind she was always a very handsome young lady, and she seemed vastly contented. Mrs. Dashwood could think of no other question, and Thomas and the tablecloth, now alike needless, were soon afterwards dismissed. Marian had already sent to say that she should eat nothing more. Mrs. Dashwood's and Elinor's appetites were equally lost, and Margaret may think herself very well off, that with so much uneasiness as both her sisters had lately experienced, so much reason as they had often had to be careless of their meals, she had never been obliged to go without her dinner before. When the dessert and the wine were arranged and Mrs. Dashwood and Elinor were left by themselves, they remained long together in a similarity of thoughtfulness and silence. Mrs. Dashwood feared to hazard any remark and ventured not to offer consolation. She now found that she had erred in relying on Elinor's representation of herself, and justly concluded that everything had been expressly softened at the time to spare her from an increase of unhappiness, suffering as she then had suffered for Marian. She found that she had been misled by the careful, the considerate attention of her daughter, to think the attachment, which once she had so well understood, much slighter in reality than she had been wont to believe, or than it was now proved to be. Chapter 48. Elinor now found the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event, however certain the mind may be told to consider it, and certainty itself. She now found that in spite of herself, she had always admitted a hope, while Edward remained single, that something would occur to prevent his marrying Lucy, that some resolution of his own, some mediation of friends, or some more eligible opportunity of establishment for the lady would arise to assist the happiness of all. But he was now married, and she condemned her heart for the lurking flattery which so much heightened the pain of the intelligence that he should be married soon, before as she imagined he could be in orders, and consequently before he could be in possession of the living, surprised her a little at first. But she soon saw how likely it was that Lucy, in her self-provident care, in her haste to secure him, should overlook everything but the risk of delay. They were married in town, and now hastening down to her uncle's. What had Edward felt on being within 4 miles from Barton, on seeing her mother's servant, on hearing Lucy's message? They would soon, she supposed, be settled at Delaford, that place in which so much conspired to give her an interest, which she wished to be acquainted with and yet desired to avoid. She saw them in an instant in their parsonage house, saw in Lucy the active, contriving manager, uniting at once a desire of smart appearance with the utmost frugality, and ashamed to be suspected of half her economical practices, pursuing her own interest in every thought, courting the favor of Colonel Brandon, of Mrs. Jennings, and of every wealthy friend. In Edward she knew not what she saw, nor what she wished to see. Happy or unhappy, nothing pleased her. She turned away her head from every sketch of him. Elinor flattered herself that someone of their connections in London would write to them to announce the event and give farther particulars, but day after day passed off, and brought no letter, no tidings. Though uncertain that any one were to blame, she found fault with every absent friend. They were all thoughtless or indolent. "When do you write to Colonel Brandon, ma'am?" was an inquiry which sprung from the impatience of her mind to have something going on. "I wrote to him, my love, last week, and rather expect to see than to hear from him again. I earnestly pressed his coming to us, and should not be surprised to see him walk in today or tomorrow, or any day." This was gaining something to look forward to. Colonel Brandon must have some information to give. Scarcely had she so determined it, when the figure of a man on horseback drew her eyes to the window. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon himself. Now she could hear more, and she trembled in expectation of it. But it was not Colonel Brandon, neither his air nor his height. Were it possible, she must say it must be Edward. She looked again. He had just dismounted. She could not be mistaken. It was Edward. She moved away and sat down. He comes from Mr. Pratt's purposely to see us. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself. In a moment she perceived that the others were likewise aware of the mistake. She saw her mother and Marian change color, saw them look at herself and whisper a few sentences to each other. She would have given the world to be able to speak and to make them understand that she hoped no coolness, no slight, would appear in their behavior to him, but she had no utterance and was obliged to leave all to their own discretion. Not a syllable passed aloud. They all waited in silence for the appearance of their visitor. His footsteps were heard along the gravel path. In a moment he was in the passage, and in another he was before them. His countenance, as he entered the room, was not too happy evening for Eleanor. His complexion was white with agitation, and he looked as if fearful of his reception, and conscious that he merited no kind one. Mrs. Dashwood, however, conforming, as she trusted, to the wishes of that daughter, by whom she then meant in the warmth of her heart to be guided in everything, met with a look of forced complacency, gave him her hand, and wished him joy. He colored and stammered out an unintelligible reply. Eleanor's lips had moved with her mother's, and when the moment of action was over, she wished that she had shaken hands with him too. But it was then too late, and with a countenance meaning to be open, she sat down again and talked of the weather. Marian had retreated as much as possible out of sight, to conceal her distress, and Margaret, understanding some part, but not the whole of the case, thought it incumbent on her to be dignified, and therefore took a seat as far from him as she could, and maintained a strict silence. When Eleanor had ceased to rejoice in the dryness of the season, a very awful pause took place. It was put an end to by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt obliged to hope that he had left Mrs. Ferrars very well. In a hurried manner, he replied in the affirmative. Another pause. Eleanor, resolving to exert herself, though fearing the sound of her own voice, now said, "Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple?" "At Longstaple," he replied, with an air of surprise. "No, my mother is in town." "I meant," said Eleanor, taking up some work from the table, "to inquire for Mrs. Edward Ferrars." She dared not look up, but her mother and Marian both turned their eyes on him. He colored, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation, said, "Perhaps you mean my brother, you mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars," was repeated by Marian and her mother in an accent of the utmost amazement, and, though Eleanor could not speak, evening her eyes were fixed on him with the same impatient wonder. He rose from his seat and walked to the window, apparently from not knowing what to do, took up a pair of scissors that lay there, and, while spoiling both them and their sheath by cutting the latter to pieces as he spoke, said, in a hurried voice, "Perhaps you do not know, you may not have heard that my brother is lately married to the youngest, to Miss Lucy Steele." His words were echoed with unspeakable astonishment by all but Eleanor, who sat with her head leaning over her work, in a state of such agitation as made her hardly know where she was. "Yes," said he, "they were married last week, and are now at Dawlish." Eleanor could sit it no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy, which at first she thought would never cease. "Edward, who had till then looked anywhere rather than at her, saw her hurry away, and perhaps saw, or evening, heard her emotion, for immediately afterwards he fell into a reverie, which no remarks, no inquiries, no affectionate address of Mrs. Chapter 49. Unaccountable, however, as the circumstances of his release may appear to the whole family, it was certain that Edward was free, and to what purpose that freedom would be employed was easily predetermined by all, for after experiencing the blessings of one imprudent engagement, contracted without his mother's consent, as he had already done for more than 4 years, nothing less could be expected of him in the failure of that than the immediate contraction of another. His errand at Barton, in fact, was a simple one. It was only to ask Eleanor to marry him, and considering that he was not altogether inexperienced in such a question, it may be strange that he should feel so uncomfortable in the present case as he really did, so much in need of encouragement and fresh air. How soon he had walked himself into the proper resolution, however, how soon an opportunity of exercising it occurred, in what manner he expressed himself, and how he was received, need not be particularly told. This only need be said, that when they all sat down to table at 4 o'clock, about 3 hours after his arrival, he had secured his lady, engaged her mother's consent, and was not only in the rapturous profession of the lover, but in the reality of reason and truth, one of the happiest of men. His situation truly was more than commonly joyful. He had more than the ordinary triumph of accepted love to swell his heart and raise his spirits. He was released without any reproach to himself from an entanglement which had long formed his misery, from a woman whom he had long ceased to love, and elevated at once to that security with another, which he must have thought of almost with despair as soon as he had learnt to consider it with desire. He was brought, not from doubt or suspense, but from misery to happiness, and the change was openly spoken in such a genuine, flowing, grateful cheerfulness as his friends had never witnessed in him before. His heart was now open to Eleanor, all its weaknesses, all its errors, confessed, and his first boyish attachment to Lucy treated with all the philosophic dignity of 24. "It was a foolish, idle inclination on my side," said he, "the consequence of ignorance of the world and want of employment. Had my brother given me some active profession when I was removed at 18 from the care of Mr. Pratt, I think, no, I am sure, it would never have happened, for though I left Longstaple with what I thought, at the time, a most unconquerable preference for his niece, yet had I then had any pursuit, any object to engage my time and keep me at a distance from her for a few months, I should very soon have outgrown the fancied attachment, especially by mixing more with the world, as in such case I must have done. But instead of having anything to do, instead of having any profession chosen for me, or being allowed to choose any myself, I returned home to be completely idle, and for the first 12 months afterwards I had not even the nominal employment which, belonging to the university, would have given me, for I was not entered at Oxford till I was 19. I had therefore nothing in the world to do but to fancy myself in love, and as my mother did not make my home in every respect comfortable, as I had no friend, no companion in my brother, and disliked new acquaintance, it was not unnatural for me to be very often at Longstaple, where I always felt myself at home, and was always sure of a welcome, and accordingly I spent the greatest part of my time there from 18 to 19. Lucy appeared everything that was amiable and obliging. She was pretty too, at least I thought so then, and I had seen so little of other women that I could make no comparisons and see no defects. Considering everything, therefore, I hope, foolish as our engagement was, foolish as it has since in every way been proved, it was not at the time an unnatural or an inexcusable piece of folly. The change which a few hours had wrought in the minds and the happiness of the Dashwoods was so great, as promised them all the satisfaction of a sleepless night. Mrs. Dashwood, too happy to be comfortable, knew not how to love Edward, nor praise Elinor enough, how to be enough thankful for his release without wounding his delicacy, nor how at once to give them leisure for unrestrained conversation together, and yet enjoy, as she wished, the sight and society of both. Marian could speak her happiness only by tears. Comparisons would occur, regrets would arise, and her joy, though sincere as her love for her sister, was of a kind to give her neither spirits nor language. But Elinor, how are her feelings to be described? From the moment of learning that Lucy was married to another, that Edward was free, to the moment of his justifying the hopes which had so instantly followed, she was everything by turns but tranquil. But when the second moment had passed, when she found every doubt, every solicitude removed, compared her situation with what so lately it had been, saw him honorably released from his former engagement, saw him instantly profiting by the release to address herself and declare an affection as tender, as constant as she had ever supposed it to be, she was oppressed, she was overcome by her own felicity, and happily disposed, as is the human mind, to be easily familiarized with any change for the better. It required several hours to give sedateness to her spirits, or any degree of tranquillity to her heart. Edward was now fixed at the cottage at least for a week, for whatever other claims may be made on him, it was impossible that less than a week should be given up to the enjoyment of Elinor's company, or suffice to say half that was to be said of the past, the present, and the future. For though a very few hours spent in the hard labor of incessant talking will dispatch more subjects than can really be in common between any two rational creatures, yet with lovers it is different. Between them no subject is finished, no communication is evening made, till it has been made at least 20 times over. Lucy's marriage, the unceasing and reasonable wonder among them all, formed of course one of the earliest discussions of the lovers, and Elinor's particular knowledge of each party made it appear to her in every view as one of the most extraordinary and unaccountable circumstances she had ever heard. How they could be thrown together, and by what attraction Robert could be drawn on to marry a girl of whose beauty she had herself heard him speak without any admiration, a girl too already engaged to his brother, and on whose account that brother had been thrown off by his family, it was beyond her comprehension to make out. To her own heart it was a delightful affair, to her imagination it was even a ridiculous one, but to her reason, her judgment, it was completely a puzzle. Edward could only attempt an explanation by supposing that, perhaps, at first accidentally meeting, the vanity of the one had been so worked on by the flattery of the other as to lead by degrees to all the rest. Elinor remembered what Robert had told her in Harley Street of his opinion of what his own mediation in his brother's affairs may have done, if applied to in time. She repeated it to Edward. That was exactly like Robert, was his immediate observation, and that, he soon added, may perhaps be in his head when the acquaintance between them first began, and Lucy perhaps at first may think only of procuring his good offices in my favor. Other designs may afterward arise. How long it had been carrying on between them, however, he was equally at a loss with herself to make out, for at Oxford, where he had remained for choice ever since his quitting London, he had had no means of hearing of her but from herself, and her letters to the very last were neither less frequent nor less affectionate than usual. Not the smallest suspicion, therefore, had ever occurred to prepare him for what followed, and when at last it burst on him in a letter from Lucy herself, he had been for some time, he believed, half stupefied between the wonder, the horror, and the joy of such a deliverance. He put the letter into Elinor's hands. "Dear Sir, being very sure I have long lost your affections, I have thought myself at liberty to bestow my own on another, and have no doubt of being as happy with him as I once used to think I may be with you. But I scorn to accept a hand while the heart was another's. Sincerely wish you happy in your choice, and it shall not be my fault if we are not always good friends, as our near relationship now makes proper. I can safely say I owe you no ill will, and am sure you will be too generous to do us any ill offices. Your brother has gained my affections entirely, and as we could not live without one another, we are just returned from the altar and are now on our way to Dawlish for a few weeks, which place your dear brother has great curiosity to see, but thought I would first trouble you with these few lines, and shall always remain your sincere well-wisher, friend, and sister, Lucy Ferrars. I have burnt all your letters, and will return your picture the first opportunity. Please to destroy my scrawls, but the ring with my hair you are very welcome to keep. Elinor read and returned it without any comment. I will not ask your opinion of it as a composition, said Edward. For worlds would not I have had a letter of her seen by you in former days. In a sister it is bad enough, but in a wife, how I have blushed over the pages of her writing, and I believe I may say that since the first half year of our foolish business, this is the only letter I ever received from her, of which the substance made me any amends for the defect of the style. However it may have come about, said Elinor, after a pause, they are certainly married, and your mother has brought on herself a most appropriate punishment. The independence she settled on Robert, through resentment against you, has put it in his power to make his own choice, and she has actually been bribing one son with 1,000 a year to do the very deed which she disinherited the other for intending to do. She will hardly be less hurt, I suppose, by Robert's marrying Lucy than she would have been by your marrying her. She will be more hurt by it, for Robert always was her favorite. She will be more hurt by it, and on the same principle will forgive him much sooner. In what state the affair stood at present between them, Edward knew not, for no communication with any of his family had yet been attempted by him. He had quitted Oxford within 24 hours after Lucy's letter arrived, and with only one object before him, the nearest road to Barton, had had no leisure to form any scheme of conduct with which that road did not hold the most intimate connection. He could do nothing till he were assured of his fate with Miss Dashwood, and by his rapidity in seeking that fate, it is to be supposed, in spite of the jealousy with which he had once thought of Colonel Brandon, in spite of the modesty with which he rated his own deserts, and the politeness with which he talked of his doubts, he did not, upon the whole, expect a very cruel reception. It was his business, however, to say that he did, and he said it very prettily. What he may say on the subject 12 a month after must be referred to the imagination of husbands and wives. That Lucy had certainly meant to deceive, to go off with a flourish of malice against him in her message by Thomas, was perfectly clear to Elinor, and Edward himself, now thoroughly enlightened on her character, had no scruple in believing her capable of the utmost meanness of wanton ill nature. Though his eyes had been long opened, evening before his acquaintance with Elinor began, to her ignorance and a want of liberality in some of her opinions, they had been equally imputed by him to her want of education. Until her last letter reached him, he had always believed her to be a well-disposed, good-hearted girl, and thoroughly attached to himself. Nothing but such a persuasion could have prevented his putting an end to an engagement which, long before the discovery of it laid him open to his mother's anger, had been a continual source of disquiet and regret to him. I thought it my duty, said he, independent of my feelings, to give her the option of continuing the engagement or not, when I was renounced by my mother and stood to all appearance without a friend in the world to assist me in such a situation as that, where there seemed nothing to tempt the avarice or the vanity of any living creature. How could I suppose, when she so earnestly, so warmly, insisted on sharing my fate, whatever it may be, that anything but the most disinterested affection was her inducement? And evening now, I cannot comprehend on what motive she acted, or what fancied advantage it could be to her to be fettered to a man for whom she had not the smallest regard, and who had only £2,000 in the world. She could not foresee that Colonel Brandon would give me a living. No, but she may suppose that something would occur in your favor, that your own family may in time relent, and at any rate she lost nothing by continuing the engagement, for she has proved that it fettered neither her inclination nor her actions. The connection was certainly a respectable one, and probably gained her consideration among her friends, and if nothing more advantageous occurred, it would be better for her to marry you than be single. Edward was, of course, immediately convinced that nothing could have been more natural than Lucy's conduct, nor more self-evident than the motive of it. Elinor scolded him harshly, as ladies always scold the imprudence which compliments themselves for having spent so much time with them at Norland, when he must have felt his own inconstancy. Your behavior was certainly very wrong, said she, because, to say nothing of my own conviction, our relations were all led away by it to fancy and expect what, as you were then situated, could never be. He could only plead an ignorance of his own heart, and a mistaken confidence in the force of his engagement. I was simple enough to think that because my faith was plighted to another, there could be no danger in my being with you, and that the consciousness of my engagement was to keep my heart as safe and sacred as my honor. I felt that I admired you, but I told myself it was only friendship, until I began to make comparisons between yourself and Lucy. I did not know how far I was got. After that, I suppose I was wrong in remaining so much in Sussex, and the arguments with which I reconciled myself to the expediency of it were no better than these. The danger is my own. I am doing no injury to anybody but myself. Elinor smiled and shook her head. Edward heard with pleasure of Colonel Brandon's being expected at the cottage, as he really wished not only to be better acquainted with him, but to have an opportunity of convincing him that he no longer resented his giving him the living of De Laford, which, at present, said he, after thanks so ungraciously delivered as mine were on the occasion, he must think I have never forgiven him for offering. Now he felt astonished himself that he had never yet been to the place, but so little interest had he taken in the matter that he owed all his knowledge of the house, garden, and glebe, extent of the parish, condition of the land, and rate of the tithes, to Elinor herself, who had heard so much of it from Colonel Brandon, and heard it with so much attention as to be entirely mistress of the subject. One question after this only remained undecided between them. One difficulty only was to be overcome. They were brought together by mutual affection, with the warmest approbation of their real friends. Their intimate knowledge of each other seemed to make their happiness certain, and they only wanted something to live upon. Edward had £2,000, and Elinor one which, with De Laford living, was all that they could call their own, for it was impossible that Mrs. Dashwood should advance anything, and they were neither of them quite enough in love to think that £350 a year would supply them with the comforts of life. Edward was not entirely without hopes of some favorable change in his mother towards him, and on that he rested for the residue of their income. But Elinor had no such dependence, for since Edward would still be unable to marry Miss Morton, and his choosing herself had been spoken of in Mrs. Ferrars's flattering language as only a lesser evil than his choosing Lucy Steele, she feared that Robert's offense would serve no other purpose than to enrich Fanny. About 4 days after Edward's arrival, Colonel Brandon appeared, to complete Mrs. Dashwood's satisfaction, and to give her the dignity of having for the first time since her living at Barton, more company with her than her house would hold. Edward was allowed to retain the privilege of first comer, and Colonel Brandon therefore walked every night to his old quarters at the park, from where he usually returned in the morning, early enough to interrupt the lovers' first tete-a-tete before breakfast. A 3 weeks' residence at Delaford, where, in his evening hours at least, he had little to do but to calculate the disproportion between 36 and 17, brought him to Barton in a temper of mind which needed all the improvement in Marian's looks, all the kindness of her welcome, and all the encouragement of her mother's language to make it cheerful. Among such friends, however, and such flattery, he did revive. No rumor of Lucy's marriage had yet reached him. He knew nothing of what had passed, and the first hours of his visit were consequently spent in hearing and in wondering. Everything was explained to him by Mrs. Dashwood, and he found fresh reason to rejoice in what he had done for Mr. Ferrars, since eventually it promoted the interest of Elinor. It would be needless to say that the gentlemen advanced in the good opinion of each other as they advanced in each other's acquaintance, for it could not be otherwise. Their resemblance in good principles, and good sense in disposition and manner of thinking, would probably have been sufficient to unite them in friendship without any other attraction, but their being in love with two sisters, and two sisters fond of each other, made that mutual regard inevitable and immediate, which may otherwise have waited the effect of time and judgment. The letters from town, which a few days before would have made every nerve in Elinor's body thrill with transport, now arrived to be read with less emotion than mirth. Mrs. Jennings wrote to tell the wonderful tale, to vent her honest indignation against the jilting girl, and pour forth her compassion towards poor Mr. Edward, who, she was sure, had quite doted upon the worthless hussy, and was now, by all accounts, almost broken-hearted at Oxford. I do think, she continued, nothing was ever carried on so sly, for it was but 2 days before Lucy called and sat a couple of hours with me. Not a soul suspected anything of the matter, not even Nancy, who, poor soul, came crying to me the day after, in a great fright for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, as well as not knowing how to get to Plymouth. For Lucy, it seems, borrowed all her money before she went off to be married, on purpose, we suppose, to make a show with, and poor Nancy had not 7 shillings in the world, so I was very glad to give her 5 guineas to take her down to Exeter, where she thinks of staying 3 or 4 weeks with Mrs. Burgess, in hopes, as I tell her, to fall in with the doctor again. And I must say that Lucy's crossness not to take them along with them in the chaise is worse than all. Poor Mr. Edward, I cannot get him out of my head, but you must send for him to Barton, and Miss Marian must try to comfort him. Mr. Dashwood's strains were more solemn. Mrs. Ferrars was the most unfortunate of women. Poor Fanny had suffered agonies of sensibility, and he considered the existence of each, under such a blow, with grateful wonder. Robert's offense was unpardonable, but Lucy's was infinitely worse. Neither of them were ever again to be mentioned to Mrs. Ferrars an evening. If she may hereafter be induced to forgive her son, his wife should never be acknowledged as her daughter, nor be permitted to appear in her presence. The secrecy with which everything had been carried on between them was rationally treated as enormously heightening the crime, because, had any suspicion of it occurred to the others, proper measures would have been taken to prevent the marriage, and he called on Elinor to join with him in regretting that Lucy's engagement with Edward had not rather been fulfilled than that she should thus be the means of spreading misery farther in the family. He thus continued: Mrs. Ferrars has never yet mentioned Edward's name, which does not surprise us, but, to our great astonishment, not a line has been received from him on the occasion. Perhaps, however, he is kept silent by his fear of offending, and I shall, therefore, give him a hint by a line to Oxford, that his sister and I both think a letter of proper submission from him, addressed perhaps to Fanny, and by her shewn to her mother, may not be taken amiss, for we all know the tenderness of Mrs. Ferrars's heart, and that she wishes for nothing so much as to be on good terms with her children. This paragraph was of some importance to the prospects and conduct of Edward. It determined him to attempt a reconciliation, though not exactly in the manner pointed out by their brother and sister. A letter of proper submission, repeated he, would they have me beg my mother's pardon for Robert's ingratitude to her and breach of honor to me? I can make no submission. I am grown neither humble nor penitent by what has passed. I am grown very happy, but that would not interest. I know of no submission that is proper for me to make. You may certainly ask to be forgiven, said Elinor, because you have offended, and I should think you may now venture so far as to profess some concern for having ever formed the engagement which drew on you your mother's anger. He agreed that he may. Chapter 50. After a proper resistance on the part of Mrs. Ferrars, just so violent and so steady as to preserve her from that reproach which she always seemed fearful of incurring, the reproach of being too amiable, Edward was admitted to her presence and pronounced to be again her son. Her family had of late been exceedingly fluctuating. For many years of her life she had had two sons, but the crime and annihilation of Edward, a few weeks ago, had robbed her of one. The similar annihilation of Robert had left her for a fortnight without any, and now, by the resuscitation of Edward, she had one again. In spite of his being allowed once more to live, however, he did not feel the continuance of his existence secure till he had revealed his present engagement, for the publication of that circumstance he feared may give a sudden turn to his constitution and carry him off as rapidly as before. With apprehensive caution therefore it was revealed, and he was listened to with unexpected calmness. Mrs. Ferrars at first reasonably endeavored to dissuade him from marrying. Miss Dashwood, by every argument in her power, told him that in Miss Morton he would have a woman of higher rank and larger fortune, and enforced the assertion by observing that Miss Morton was the daughter of a nobleman with 30,000 pounds, while Miss Dashwood was only the daughter of a private gentleman with no more than 3. But when she found that, though perfectly admitting the truth of her representation, he was by no means inclined to be guided by it, she judged it wisest, from the experience of the past, to submit, and therefore, after such an ungracious delay as she owed to her own dignity, and as served to prevent every suspicion of goodwill, she issued her decree of consent to the marriage of Edward and Elinor. What she would engage to do towards augmenting their income was next to be considered, and here it plainly appeared that though Edward was now her only son, he was by no means her eldest, for while Robert was inevitably endowed with 1,000 pounds a year, not the smallest objection was made against Edward's taking orders for the sake of 250 at the utmost, nor was anything promised either for the present or in future beyond the 10,000 pounds which had been given with Fanny. It was as much, however, as was desired, and more than was expected by Edward and Elinor, and Mrs. Ferrars herself, by her shuffling excuses, seemed the only person surprised at her not giving more. With an income quite sufficient to their wants thus secured to them, they had nothing to wait for after Edward was in possession of the living, but the readiness of the house, to which Colonel Brandon, with an eager desire for the accommodation of Elinor, was making considerable improvements, and after waiting some time for their completion, after experiencing, as usual, 1,000 disappointments and delays from the unaccountable dilatoriness of the workmen, Elinor, as usual, broke through the first positive resolution of not marrying till everything was ready, and the ceremony took place in Barton Church early in the autumn. The first month after their marriage was spent with their friend at the mansion house, from where they could superintend the progress of the parsonage and direct everything as they liked on the spot, could choose papers, project shrubberies, and invent a sweep. Mrs. Jennings's prophecies, though rather jumbled together, were chiefly fulfilled, for she was able to visit Edward and his wife in their parsonage by Michaelmas, and she found in Elinor and her husband, as she really believed, one of the happiest couples in the world. They had, in fact, nothing to wish for but the marriage of Colonel Brandon and Marian, and rather better pasturage for their cows. They were visited on their first settling by almost all their relations and friends. Mrs. Ferrars came to inspect the happiness which she was almost ashamed of having authorized, and evening the Dashwoods were at the expense of a journey from Sussex to do them honor. "I will not say that I am disappointed, my dear sister," said John, as they were walking together one morning before the gates of Delaford House. "That would be saying too much, for certainly you have been one of the most fortunate young women in the world, as it is. But I confess it would give me great pleasure to call Colonel Brandon brother. His property here, his place, his house, everything is in such respectable and excellent condition. And his woods, I have not seen such timber anywhere in Dorsetshire as there is now standing in Delaford Hanger. And though, perhaps, Marian may not seem exactly the person to attract him, yet I think it would altogether be advisable for you to have them now frequently staying with you, for as Colonel Brandon seems a great deal at home, nobody can tell what may happen, for when people are much thrown together and see little of anybody else, and it will always be in your power to set her off to advantage, and so forth. In short, you may as well give her a chance, you understand me." But though Mrs. Ferrars did come to see them, and always treated them with the make-believe of decent affection, they were never insulted by her real favor and preference. That was due to the folly of Robert and the cunning of his wife, and it was earned by them before many months had passed away. The selfish sagacity of the latter, which had at first drawn Robert into the scrape, was the principal instrument of his deliverance from it, for her respectful humility, assiduous attentions, and endless flatteries as soon as the smallest opening was given for their exercise reconciled Mrs. Ferrars to his choice and re-established him completely in her favor. The whole of Lucy's behavior in the affair, and the prosperity which crowned it, therefore, may be held forth as a most encouraging instance of what an earnest and unceasing attention to self-interest, however its progress may be apparently obstructed, will do in securing every advantage of fortune, with no other sacrifice than that of time and conscience. When Robert first sought her acquaintance, and privately visited her in Bartlett's Buildings, it was only with the view imputed to him by his brother. He merely meant to persuade her to give up the engagement, and as there could be nothing to overcome but the affection of both, he naturally expected that one or two interviews would settle the matter. In that point, however, and that only, he erred, for though Lucy soon gave him hopes that his eloquence would convince her, in time another visit, another conversation, was always wanted to produce this conviction. Some doubts always lingered in her mind when they parted, which could only be removed by another half-hour's discourse with himself. His attendance was by this means secured, and the rest followed in course. Instead of talking of Edward, they came gradually to talk only of Robert, a subject on which he had always more to say than on any other, and in which she soon betrayed an interest equal to his own, and in short, it became speedily evident to both that he had entirely supplanted his brother. He was proud of his conquest, proud of tricking Edward, and very proud of marrying privately without his mother's consent. What immediately followed is known. They passed some months in great happiness at Dawlish, for she had many relations and old acquaintances to cut, and he drew several plans for magnificent cottages, and from there, returning to town, procured the forgiveness of Mrs. Ferrars by the simple expedient of asking it, which, at Lucy's instigation, was adopted. The forgiveness, at first, truly, as was reasonable, comprehended only Robert, and Lucy, who had owed his mother no duty and therefore could have transgressed none, still remained some weeks longer unpardoned, but perseverance in humility of conduct and messages in self-condemnation for Robert's offense and gratitude for the unkindness she was treated with procured her in time the haughty notice which overcame her by its graciousness, and led soon afterwards by rapid degrees to the highest state of affection and influence. Lucy became as necessary to Mrs. Ferrars as either Robert or Fanny, and while Edward was never cordially forgiven for having once intended to marry her, and Elinor, though superior to her in fortune and birth, was spoken of as an intruder, she was in everything considered and always openly acknowledged to be a favorite child. They settled in town, received very liberal assistance from Mrs. Ferrars, were on the best terms imaginable with the Dashwoods, and setting aside the jealousies and ill will continually subsisting between Fanny and Lucy, in which their husbands of course took a part, as well as the frequent domestic disagreements between Robert and Lucy themselves, nothing could exceed the harmony in which they all lived together. What Edward had done to forfeit the right of eldest son may have puzzled many people to find out, and what Robert had done to succeed to it may have puzzled them still more. It was an arrangement, however, justified in its effects, if not in its cause, for nothing ever appeared in Robert's style of living or of talking to give a suspicion of his regretting the extent of his income, as either leaving his brother too little or bringing himself too much, and if Edward may be judged from the ready discharge of his duties in every particular, from an increasing attachment to his wife and his home, and from the regular cheerfulness of his spirits, he may be supposed no less contented with his lot, no less free from every wish of an exchange. Elinor's marriage divided her as little from her family as could well be contrived, without rendering the cottage at Barton entirely useless, for her mother and sisters spent much more than half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was acting on motives of policy as well as pleasure, in the frequency of her visits at Delaford, for her wish of bringing Marian and Colonel Brandon together was hardly less earnest, though rather more liberal than what John had expressed. It was now her darling object, precious as was the company of her daughter to her. She desired nothing so much as to give up its constant enjoyment to her valued friend, and to see Marian settled at the mansion house was equally the wish of Edward and Elinor. They each felt his sorrows and their own obligations, and Marian, by general consent, was to be the reward of all. With such a confederacy against her, with a knowledge so intimate of his goodness, with a conviction of his fond attachment to herself, which at last, though long after it was observable to everybody else, burst on her, what could she do? Marian Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions, and to counteract, by her conduct, her most favorite maxims. She was born to overcome an affection formed so late in life as at 17, and with no sentiment superior to strong esteem and lively friendship, voluntarily to give her hand to another, and that other, a man who had suffered no less than herself under the event of a former attachment, whom 2 years before she had considered too old to be married, and who still sought the constitutional safeguard of a flannel waistcoat. But so it was. Instead of falling a sacrifice to an irresistible passion, as once she had fondly flattered herself with expecting, instead of remaining evening forever with her mother, and finding her only pleasures in retirement and study, as afterwards in her more calm and sober judgment she had determined on, she found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of a family, and the patroness of a village. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who best loved him believed he deserved to be. In Marian he was consoled for every past affliction, her regard, and her society restored his mind to animation and his spirits to cheerfulness, and that Marian found her own happiness in forming his was equally the persuasion and delight of each observing friend. Marian could never love by halves, and her whole heart became, in time, as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. Willoughby could not hear of her marriage without a pang, and his punishment was soon afterwards complete in the voluntary forgiveness of Mrs. Smith, who, by stating his marriage with a woman of character as the source of her clemency, gave him reason for believing that had he behaved with honor towards Marian, he may at once have been happy and rich, that his repentance of misconduct, which thus brought its own punishment, was sincere, need not be doubted, nor that he long thought of Colonel Brandon with envy and of Marian with regret, but that he was forever inconsolable, that he fled from society, or contracted an habitual gloom of temper, or died of a broken heart, must not be depended on, for he did neither. He lived to exert, and frequently to enjoy himself. His wife was not always out of humor, nor his home always uncomfortable, and in his breed of horses and dogs, and in sporting of every kind, he found no inconsiderable degree of domestic felicity. For Marian, however, in spite of his incivility in surviving her loss, he always retained that decided regard which interested him in everything that befell her, and made her his secret standard of perfection in woman, and many a rising beauty would be slighted by him in after days as bearing no comparison with Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Dashwood was prudent enough to remain at the cottage without attempting a removal to De Laford, and fortunately for Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, when Marian was taken from them, Margaret had reached an age highly suitable for dancing, and not very ineligible for being supposed to have a lover.